Duke Cassian Blackthorne ruled the North like winter ruled the dead. Cold, absolute, unforgiving. They said he married Lady Seraphine Vale the way a predator claims territory, with teeth bared and blood still warm on his hands. But what the nobles never understood was this: the most dangerous men don't rage when they love. They become surgical. And when the entire kingdom tried to rip her away from him, they discovered why fear had always been his most loyal weapon. Stay until the end to see how a monster proved he was made, not born. Drop a like if you're watching from your city, and let me know in the comments where you're following this from. The sea below Ravenspire didn't crash against the cliffs. It detonated. Every wave struck black rock like artillery fire, sending spray 200 feet into the air, where it froze mid-flight and shattered across the battlements. The locals said the ocean was trying to tear the fortress down. The ocean had been failing for 3 centuries. Duke Cassian Blackthorne stood at the highest window of the North Tower, watching the storm build itself into something biblical. Lightning fractured the horizon. Thunder rolled across the water like distant cannon fire. His reflection in the glass looked carved from the same black stone as the walls around him. Sharp jaw, eyes the color of steel left too long in winter, shoulders that carried violence the way other men carried titles. He was 32 years old and had been called a monster since he was 19. The knock on the door came precisely at 8. Everything in Ravenspire happened precisely. Chaos was for weaker houses. "Come in." The servant who entered kept his eyes on the floor like he'd been trained. A letter rested on the silver tray he carried. Red wax seal. The crest of House Vale pressed into it like a wound that hadn't finished bleeding. Cassian took the letter without looking at the man. "Leave." The door closed with a whisper of hinges oiled to perfection. Alone again, Cassian broke the seal and read words that should have meant nothing. A minor noble family from the eastern provinces. Debts that had metastasized across 3 generations. A daughter offered in marriage as final payment for crimes her grandfather had committed before she was born. Lady Seraphine Vale. He'd been watching her for 2 years. Not the way men watched women at court, with hunger dressed up as admiration. Cassian watched her the way generals studied terrain before a campaign. He learned the architecture of her, the way she held herself when surrounded by nobles who saw her family name as a punchline, the precision she used to dismantle men twice her age during political debates they thought she had no business joining. She moved through ballrooms like someone who understood that survival required strategy, not luck. And he'd wanted her the way deserts want rain, not because she was beautiful, though she was, not because she was intelligent, though that made her dangerous in ways the aristocracy hadn't figured out yet. He wanted her because she was the only person he'd ever watched navigate the court without becoming what it demanded. She bent. She adapted. But she never broke into something unrecognizable. That kind of strength didn't come from privilege. It came from necessity. So Cassian had done what predators do. He removed every obstacle between himself and what he wanted. House Vale's debts disappeared through anonymous transactions. Her younger brother's gambling scandal was buried so deep it would take an archaeological dig to find it. Properties that should have been seized were quietly returned. Enemies who circled her family the way vultures circle dying things suddenly found themselves bankrupt, disgraced, or dead. And when her father received the offer of marriage from the Duke of Ravenspire himself, it came with terms that looked like mercy but felt like inevitability. Cassian set the letter down and returned to the window. 3 days until she arrived. 3 days until he found out if possession could ever feel like anything other than theft. The wedding took place during the first week of winter when snow fell like broken glass, and the cathedral smelled of burning candles mixed with something older, something that lived in stone. Seraphine Vale walked down the aisle in a dress the color of midnight, stitched with silver thread that caught the light like scars. She didn't smile. Cassian respected her for that. The priest spoke in Latin that echoed off vaulted ceilings 200 feet overhead. Noble families filled the pews like an audience at an execution, watching to see if the infamous Duke would finally show something human. He didn't. He stood beside Seraphine like a monument to discipline, his face carved from ice and iron discipline. When the vows required him to take her hand, he did it with the efficiency of a transaction. When tradition demanded a kiss, he pressed his mouth to hers for exactly 3 seconds. No passion, no tenderness, just proof that the contract had been signed in flesh instead of ink. Afterward, during the reception in Ravenspire's Great Hall, nobles descended on them like well-dressed sharks. Duke Cassian, Lady Lenora Whitfeld purred, her smile sharp enough to draw blood. What a remarkable acquisition. The Duchess will be such an asset to your household. She emphasized asset the way butchers emphasized meat. Seraphine's hand tightened almost imperceptibly around her wineglass. Cassian saw it. He always saw everything. Lady Whitfeld, he said, his voice cold enough to frost the air between them, my wife is not livestock to be appraised at market. Perhaps you've confused her with your own daughters. I understand they've been on sale for quite some time without attracting serious offers. The color drained from Lenore's face. Around them, conversation stuttered and died. No one insulted the Whitfeld family publicly. They controlled half the trade routes through the southern ports and could destroy lesser houses with a signature. Cassian didn't care. He'd destroyed greater threats before breakfast. Lenora recovered with the skill of someone who'd spent decades swallowing humiliation and calling it diplomacy. Of course, Your Grace. I meant no offense. She turned to Seraphine with eyes like poison. Welcome to the North, my dear. I do hope you survive it. Then she glided away, leaving the scent of expensive perfume and barely concealed threats. Seraphine finally looked at Cassian. It was the first time their eyes had met since the ceremony. Hers were the color of autumn before everything died. Brown shot through with gold that seemed to catch fire in the candlelight. Was that protection or territory marking? She asked. Her voice carried an edge he hadn't expected. Most noble women would have been grateful. Most would have bowed their heads and played the role of rescued maiden. Seraphine Vale apparently didn't believe in most. Cassian studied her for 3 long seconds. Does it matter? Yes. Why? Because one means you think I'm too weak to defend myself. The other means you consider me property worth defending. She took a sip of wine, her expression unreadable. I need to know which cage I'm standing in. Around them, the reception continued. Music, laughter, the performative joy of people who measured their worth in titles and bloodlines. But in the space between the Duke and his new Duchess, something else happened. Recognition, not affection, not attraction. Just the cold acknowledgement that they were both predators who'd learned to survive by understanding the rules of a game that killed most players before they turned 20. Cassian leaned closer, his voice dropping to something that wouldn't carry past her ears. You're not in a cage, Seraphine. You're in a fortress. The difference is that fortresses are designed to keep threats out, not to keep you trapped. But if you try to burn it down from the inside, I won't stop you. I'll just make sure the fire doesn't spread beyond these walls. She held his gaze without flinching. And if I decide to leave? Then you leave, just like that? Just like that, liar. He smiled for the first time that night. It wasn't a pleasant expression. You don't know me well enough yet to make that assessment. I know men like you, she replied. You don't let go of anything you've claimed. Not land, not power, not wives purchased with blood money and family debts. Cassian should have been angry. He should have reminded her that she was Duchess of Ravenspire now, that her words could be considered treason depending on who overheard them. But instead, he felt something dangerous stir beneath the ice he'd spent years building inside his chest. Interest. You're right, he said quietly. I don't let go. But you should ask yourself why I wanted you in the first place before you assume I see you as another possession to be cataloged and stored. Before Seraphine could respond, Duke Armand Thorne approached with the kind of false cheer that preceded knives in the dark. Cassian, magnificent ceremony. Absolutely magnificent. He clapped Cassian on the shoulder with the familiarity of someone who'd never learned that touching the Duke of Ravenspire without permission was a good way to lose fingers. And Lady Seraphine, welcome to our illustrious circle. I do hope the Duke has explained the expectations that come with your new title. Cassian's expression went glacial. Armand, if you have something to say it clearly. My wife doesn't require translation. Armand's smile sharpened. Of course. I simply meant that Ravenspire has always been known for its discipline, its order, some might say its inflexibility. He looked pointedly at Seraphine. Change can be disruptive in such a carefully maintained environment. Seraphine set down her wineglass with deliberate care. Duke Thorne, I appreciate your concern, but I wasn't aware that maintaining order required permission from outside houses. Perhaps you've confused Ravenspire with your own estate. I understand you've had quite a bit of disruption lately. Something about missing grain shipments and unexplained fires in your warehouses? The silence that followed was surgical. Armand's face went through three distinct shades of red before settling on something that looked like barely controlled rage. Those incidents are being investigated. How thorough, Seraphine said pleasantly. I do hope the investigation doesn't uncover anything embarrassing. It would be such a shame for your family's reputation. Armand opened his mouth, closed it, then turned and walked away with the stiff gait of someone who'd just been gutted in public and was trying not to bleed on the marble. Cassian waited until he was out of earshot. You just made an enemy. Seraphine picked up her wine glass again. Then he can get in line behind all the others. For the first time in years, Cassian felt something that might have been admiration crack through his carefully maintained control. This woman was going to be a problem. He was starting to think he'd planned it that way. Atag. The wedding night happened in silence. Cassian led Seraphine through Ravenspire's endless corridors to the Duchess's chambers, rooms that had been empty since his mother's death 20 years ago. Servants had prepared everything with the precision he demanded. Fires burned in both hearths. Candles cast shadows that moved like living things across tapestries depicting battles where the Blackthorns always won. The bed was large enough to sleep 4 people and looked like it had been carved from a single piece of black oak. Seraphine walked to the window and looked out at the storm. Lightning illuminated the sea below, turning the waves into something that belonged in nightmares. Cassian stood near the door, his hands clasped behind his back like he was reviewing troops. Your rooms connect to mine through that door. He gestured to a panel in the east wall. You may lock it from your side if you prefer. I won't enter without permission. She turned to face him, surprise flickering across her features before she controlled it. You're not going to demand consummation? The marriage is legal regardless. The church has its signatures. The nobility has its spectacle. What happens between us doesn't require an audience. So this is just another transaction. Cassian moved closer, not threatening but not exactly safe either. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough to see the gold flecks in her eyes, far enough to maintain the illusion of civility. You want honesty? I wouldn't have asked otherwise. Then here it is. I didn't marry you because I needed an heir. I didn't marry you to cement an alliance or acquire territory. I married you because I've spent 2 years watching you survive in a world designed to eat people like you alive, and you're still standing. That's rarer than any title, rarer than any bloodline. Seraphine's breath caught. That's not honesty. That's obsession. Maybe. He tilted his head slightly, studying her like she was a puzzle he was determined to solve. But obsession implies irrationality. I'm never irrational. Everything I do has a purpose. Everything I want has a reason. And what reason did you have for destroying my family's enemies? For erasing our debts before you ever made your offer? Her eyes widened. How did you— Because I'm very good at finding out things people try to hide, he interrupted. And yes, I manipulated circumstances to make this marriage inevitable. I won't apologize for that. Apologies are for people who regret their choices. You're a monster. Yes. You ruined people, destroyed lives. Yes. And you're telling me this why? To frighten me? To establish dominance? Cassian closed the remaining distance between them until they were close enough that he could smell the scent she wore, something like winter roses and steel. I'm telling you because I won't lie to the woman I married. You asked for honesty. This is what honest looks like when it comes from someone like me. I am dangerous. I am ruthless. I have done things that would make civilized people vomit, but I have never once pretended to be anything other than exactly what I am. Seraphine didn't back away. She should have. Any sane person would have. But she stood her ground like someone who'd learned that showing fear was the same as showing weakness. And weakness got you killed. What do you want from me? She asked quietly. Time. Time for what? To prove that I'm not your enemy. He reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched her cheek with one finger. The contact lasted less than 2 seconds before he dropped his hand. Sleep. Seraphine, you're safe here. Safer than you've ever been in your life. Then he walked to the connecting door, opened it, and disappeared into his own chambers without looking back. Seraphine stood alone in the firelight, her heart hammering against her ribs like it was trying to break free. She'd expected a tyrant. She'd expected cruelty. What she got was something far more dangerous, a man who'd learned to weaponize truth the way other men weaponized swords. Life in Ravenspire developed a rhythm that felt less like marriage and more like a tactical standoff between two armies waiting to see who'd break formation first. Cassian ruled his territory with the precision of a clockmaker building something that would outlast empires. He rose before dawn and spent hours in his study reviewing reports from stewards, military commanders, and the network of spies he maintained across the kingdom. Breakfast was taken alone. Meetings with advisors happened in the war room on the second floor, where maps covered every wall and battle strategies were discussed like theology. He walked the battlements every afternoon regardless of weather, inspecting fortifications and speaking to soldiers who feared him but followed him into hell because they knew he'd lead from the front. Seraphine watched it all with the attention of someone planning either escape or conquest. She hadn't decided which yet. The Duchess's role in Ravenspire was supposed to be decorative, host gatherings, smile at nobles, provide heirs, and stay out of politics. Seraphine treated those expectations like suggestions from people whose opinions didn't matter. 3 days after the wedding, she walked into the steward's office unannounced while Marcus Brennan was reviewing expense reports. He looked up, startled, clearly not expecting the Duchess to care about grain inventories and supply routes. "Lady Seraphine," he stammered, rising from his chair. "Is there something I can help you with?" She sat down across from him without being invited. "Yes. Explain to me why the winter grain reserves are being stored in the East Warehouse when the reports show water damage from last season's flooding." Marcus's face went pale. "I assure you, Your Grace, the grain is perfectly secure." "No, it isn't." She pulled out a ledger she'd somehow acquired and opened it to a page marked with ribbon. "These numbers don't match the inventory records submitted to the Duke last month. Either you're incompetent or you're embezzling. Which is it?" The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of the fireplace. Marcus Brennan had served House Blackthorn for 15 years. He'd survived 3 different military campaigns, 2 separate investigations into financial irregularities, and 1 memorable incident where Duke Cassian had personally thrown a corrupt quartermaster off the battlements for selling weapons to enemy houses. He was not a man who frightened easily, but Lady Seraphine Val sat across from him with eyes that could see through lies the way sunlight revealed dust. And Marcus suddenly understood why the Duke had married this particular woman. She was dangerous in ways the court hadn't figured out yet. "I made an error in judgment," he said carefully. "The East Warehouse provided better protection from theft." "From theft you were committing yourself," Seraphine interrupted. "Don't insult my intelligence by lying. The grain shortages line up perfectly with unauthorized sales to Duke Armand's estate, the same Duke Armand who questioned my presence at the wedding reception." She closed the ledger with a snap that sounded like a rifle shot. "You've been stealing from Ravenspire to fund outside interests. That's treason. The Duke would have you executed for less." Marcus swallowed hard. "Lady Seraphine, please, I have a family." "Then you should have thought about them before you betrayed the man who pays your salary." She stood up, the ledger tucked under her arm. "You have 2 options. Confess everything to Duke Cassian yourself, or I present this evidence at tonight's council meeting in front of every advisor and military commander in the fortress. Your choice." She walked out before he could respond. By sunset, Marcus Brennan was kneeling in Cassian's private study, confessing to embezzlement and treason while the Duke stood with his back to the fireplace, expression unreadable. When Marcus finished, Cassian was silent for 30 seconds. Then, "My wife brought this to your attention?" "Yes, Your Grace." "And she offered you the chance to confess voluntarily?" "Yes, Your Grace." Cassian walked to the window and looked out at the darkening sky. "Marcus Brennan, you've served this house for 15 years. You fought at the Battle of Ashford Ridge. You saved 3 soldiers during the siege of Coldwater Keep. That loyalty earned you a position of trust, which you violated spectacularly." "Your Grace, I'm not finished." Cassian turned around, his expression carved from ice. "However, the fact that you chose honesty when given the option tells me you're not beyond redemption. So here's what's going to happen. You will repay every coin you stole with interest. You will serve Ravenspire for 10 more years without salary, your compensation considered payment toward your debt. You will train your replacement and ensure this never happens again. If you refuse, I will have you hanged from the battlements before dawn. If you accept, you will thank my wife for giving you a second chance you didn't deserve." Marcus's hand shook. "I accept, Your Grace." "Thank you." "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Thank the Duchess. She's the reason you're still breathing. Now get out! Marcus scrambled to his feet and fled. Cassian waited until the door closed before allowing himself a smile that would have terrified anyone who saw it. His wife was reshaping Ravenspire from the inside. He should probably be concerned about that. He wasn't. That night, Cassian knocked on the connecting door between their chambers for the first time since the wedding. "Come in," Seraphine's voice called. He found her sitting at a writing desk near the window, reviewing what looked like construction plans for the southern watchtower. She'd changed from her formal dress into something simpler, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. The firelight turned her into something that belonged in paintings people stared at for hours trying to understand. "You reorganized my household staff today," Cassian said without preamble. "I exposed a thief. You interrogated my steward without permission. I saved you from being robbed blind by someone you trusted." She set down her quill and looked at him directly. "If you're here to tell me I overstepped, save your breath. I'm not going to apologize for doing what needed to be done." Cassian closed the door behind him and walked into the room. He stopped beside the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantel. Marcus Brennan served this house for 15 years. Marcus Brennan betrayed this house for personal profit. And you discovered this how? By actually reading the financial reports instead of assuming everyone around you is loyal just because they're afraid. He should have been angry. Any other ruler would have been furious that their new wife had inserted herself into administrative matters without clearance. But Cassian had spent too many years watching people perform loyalty while planning betrayal to mistake Seraphine's actions for insubordination. She'd done exactly what needed doing, which meant she understood power better than half his advisors. "You gave him a choice," Cassian said. "Confession or exposure?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because execution creates martyrs. Reformation creates examples." She stood up and walked toward him, stopping just out of arm's reach. "You rule through fear. That works. But fear alone creates resentment, and resentment eventually becomes rebellion. If you want Ravenspire to survive past your lifetime, you need people who follow you because they believe in the system. You itamt. Not just because they're terrified of the consequences." Cassian stared at her. "Who taught you that?" "No one." She smiled, but it wasn't a happy expression. "I learned it by watching houses like mine collapse because everyone was too afraid to tell the patriarch he was making catastrophic mistakes. By the time someone found the courage to speak up, it was too late. The debts were insurmountable. The damage was permanent. Fear kills dynasties just as effectively as treason. The silence between them felt heavy enough to break bones. "You're going to transform this place," Cassian said quietly. "Is that a problem?" "It should be." He moved closer, erasing the careful distance she'd maintained. "You're dangerous, Seraphine Vale, more dangerous than any enemy I've faced." She didn't back away. "Then maybe you shouldn't have married me. Maybe I married you specifically because you're dangerous." He reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture almost tender except for the intensity in his eyes. The world doesn't need another decorative duchess. It needs someone who understands that survival requires brutality and intelligence in equal measure. "Is that what you see when you look at me? A weapon?" "No." He let his hand fall back to his side. "I see someone who refuses to be a victim. There's a difference." Seraphine studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "You're not what I expected." "Good." Cassian stepped back, creating space between them again. "Predictability is just another word for weakness." "Sleep well, Duchess. Tomorrow you're accompanying me to the northern villages. If you're going to reorganize Ravenspire, you should see all of it, not just the fortress." He left before she could respond. Behind him, Seraphine stood in the firelight, her heart doing complicated things she absolutely refused to examine too closely. The Duke of Ravenspire was a monster, but monsters, she was beginning to realize, came in more varieties than she'd been taught. The northern villages looked like places where hope went to die slowly. Seraphine rode beside Cassian through snow-packed roads that cut between cottages built from stone and desperation. Smoke rose from chimneys and thin gray columns that disappeared into clouds the color of iron. Children played in courtyards wearing clothes that had been mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible. Women drew water from wells that probably froze solid every night. This was the edge of Ravenspire's territory, where prosperity from the capital frayed into poverty that most nobles pretended didn't exist. Cassian dismounted in the central square of a village called Thornfield. The locals emerged slowly, warily, like people who'd learned that attention from power rarely ended well. The village elder, a man whose face looked carved from the same weathered stone as the buildings, approached with his hat in his hands. "Your Grace," he said, bowing lower than strictly necessary. "We weren't expecting a visit." "I don't announce visits," Cassian replied. "How are the grain stores?" "Adequate, Your Grace. Your last shipment arrived before the roads became impassable." "And the children? Any sickness?" "2 cases of fever, both recovered. The healer you sent has been invaluable." Seraphine watched the exchange with growing confusion. The duke she'd married at the cathedral was cold, brutal, efficient. The man standing in this village square was asking about fever cases and grain shipments like he actually cared whether these people lived or died. "Good," Cassian said. "If you need additional supplies before spring, send word through the usual channels. I won't have anyone starving during my watch." The elder's expression flickered with something that might have been gratitude if gratitude weren't such a dangerous emotion to show. "Thank you, Your Grace. We won't forget this." "You're not meant to forget," Cassian said bluntly. "You're meant to survive. Now show me the Eastern Bridge." The last report mentioned structural damage. As they walked through the village, Seraphine noticed details that didn't match the narrative she'd been building about her husband. Firewood stacked beside cottages that couldn't afford to buy it. Repairs on buildings that would never generate profit for the Duke's treasury. Children's clothes that looked new, distributed without ceremony or demand for payment. Cassian Blackthorn was feeding villages in secret, maintaining infrastructure no one would ever thank him for, saving lives while cultivating a reputation as a monster. "Why?" she asked quietly when they were alone near the bridge. Cassian examined the wooden supports, checking for rot. "Why what? Why help them? These people can't pay taxes. They don't serve in your military. They're not strategically important. Why waste resources on survival when you could invest in things that generate power?" He was silent for almost a minute, testing the bridge's stability with methodical precision. When he finally spoke, his voice carried something she hadn't heard before. Exhaustion. "When I was 8 years old, my father took me to a village that had been destroyed by raiders. Houses burned, bodies in the street. Children who survived became orphans in a single night. He made me walk through all of it, made me see what happens when power fails to protect the people it's supposed to defend." She heard him take a breath. "He told me that fear keeps enemies at bay, but responsibility keeps you human. The moment you forget that power exists to serve survival, you become the same kind of monster that raids villages and burns children alive." Seraphine felt something crack in her chest. "Your father sounds like he was a good man." "He was." Cassian straightened, his expression hardening back into the mask she recognized. "And good men die when better-armed predators decide to take what they've built. He was murdered in his own hall by relatives who thought he was too soft, too generous, too concerned with morality instead of domination. They carved him apart while I watched from a cupboard where a servant had hidden me. Oh God. I was 13 when I took back Ravenspire." Cassian turned to face her, his eyes empty of everything except cold mathematics. "I hunted down every person involved in his death. I gave them trials, confessions, everything civilized society demands. Then I hanged them from the battlements and left their bodies until the crows were finished. Mercy got my father killed. Fear kept me alive. So I built a reputation that makes sure no one ever forgets what happens when you threaten what belongs to me. And these villages? Why protect them if survival requires brutality? Because brutality without purpose is just cruelty." He gestured toward Thornfield, toward the children playing in the snow, toward the smoke rising from chimneys. "My father died trying to prove that power could be merciful. I survived by proving that mercy can be powerful. There's a difference." Seraphine looked at the man standing beside her, this duke who ruled like winter and bled like spring, and suddenly understood something that should have terrified her. Cassian Blackthorn wasn't a monster despite his humanity. He was a monster because of it, and somehow that made him more dangerous than any tyrant she'd ever feared. The ride back to Ravenspire happened in silence. Seraphine's mind wouldn't stop circling the same impossible realization. The man she'd married was simultaneously the most brutal and most protective force she'd ever encountered. He ruled through fear but governed with precision. He killed without remorse but ensured children didn't starve. He was a walking contradiction that somehow made perfect sense. When they reached the fortress gates, Cassian helped her dismount with hands that were surprisingly gentle. Seraphine looked up at him, at this complicated weapon of a man who'd married her for reasons she still didn't fully understand. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For showing me Thornfield. For not pretending you're something you're not." Cassian's expression shifted into something almost vulnerable before he controlled it. "Don't romanticize me, Seraphine. I'm not redeemable. I'm just practical." "Is that what you tell yourself?" "It's what keeps me alive." He released her and stepped back. "Get warm. We have council meetings tonight, and the advisors are going to test your limits now that they know you're not decorative. Let them try." He smiled, brief and sharp. "That's my Duchess." Then he walked away, leaving Seraphine standing in the courtyard with snow falling around her like silent artillery. "That's my Duchess. Not the Duchess. My Duchess." Possession and partnership wrapped together so tightly she couldn't separate where one ended and the other began. Seraphine walked into the fortress knowing three things with absolute certainty. First, Cassian Blackthorn had been watching her long before their marriage, learning her the way predators learned prey. Second, he'd built her a cage that looked like freedom and felt like protection. Third, and most dangerous, she was starting to understand why. But understanding wasn't the same as escaping. An escape was starting to feel less like salvation and more like surrender. The council meeting that night became a battlefield with words instead of swords. Ravenspire's war room was exactly what it sounded like. A massive chamber on the second floor where walls disappeared beneath maps showing territories, trade routes, and enemy positions. A table carved from a single piece of oak dominated the center, large enough to seat 20 advisors who arrived in order of military rank and political influence. Seraphine entered beside Cassian, wearing a dress the color of midnight with silver threading that caught torchlight like knives. Every eye tracked her movement. Every advisor measured her, the way soldiers measured incoming threats. She took the seat directly across from the Duke, a position traditionally reserved for military commanders. No one objected. Not after Marcus Brennan's very public confession had spread through the fortress like wildfire. Duke Cassian, Lord General Thaddeus Crane began without preamble. "We've received reports that Duke Armand is reinforcing his southern borders. The troop movements suggest preparation for either defense or aggression." His gaze flickered briefly towards Seraphine. "Some believe it's a response to recent political changes within Ravenspire." "Political changes," Seraphine said pleasantly. "Is that what we're calling my marriage now? A political change?" Thaddeus's jaw tightened. "I meant no disrespect, Lady Seraphine. Then perhaps you should stop speaking like my presence somehow threatens regional stability." She leaned forward slightly. "Duke Armand has been embezzling grain shipments from Ravenspire through corrupt stewards for months. His border reinforcements have nothing to do with me, and everything to do with the fact that his theft operation just collapsed spectacularly. If he's preparing for conflict, it's because he knows retaliation is coming." The room went absolutely silent. Cassian sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable, watching the exchange like someone observing a particularly interesting chess match. Lady Seraphine, another advisor named William Graves, interjected carefully, "While your concerns are noted, military strategy typically requires extensive experience. What it requires is accurate information," she interrupted, "which apparently no one in this room bothered to investigate before assuming Duke Armand's movements were defensive posturing." She pulled out a document from the leather satchel she'd brought and slid it across the table toward Cassian. "These are shipping manifests showing grain being diverted from Ravenspire's warehouses to Armand's estate over the past 6 months. Cross-reference them with Marcus Brennan's confession, and you'll see a pattern of systematic theft designed to weaken our winter reserves while strengthening his." "How did you acquire these?" Thaddeus demanded. "By asking the right questions of people who assumed I was too decorative to matter." Seraphine smiled, sharp as broken glass. "Underestimation is a wonderful tactical advantage." Cassian picked up the documents and reviewed them with the precision of someone who could spot lies the way normal people spotted sunlight. After 2 minutes, he set them down and looked directly at Thaddeus. "The Duchess is correct. Armand has been conducting economic warfare under the guise of routine trade. His border reinforcements are preparation for our retaliation, which he knows is inevitable." He turned his attention to the assembled advisors. "I want a full inventory of all supply routes. Any irregularities get reported directly to Lady Seraphine for analysis. If we have additional corruption, I want it exposed before our enemies can exploit it further. Thaddeus looked like he'd swallowed something poisonous. Your Grace, with respect, the Duchess has only been at Ravenspire for a week. And in that week, she's discovered treachery that you and your intelligence network missed entirely. Cassian's voice dropped into something colder than winter. Perhaps that should concern you more than her inexperience. The meeting continued for another hour, but the power dynamic had shifted permanently. Seraphine Vale wasn't the Duke's decorative wife. She was the weapon he'd been waiting to deploy. 1. After the council disbanded, Cassian found Seraphine standing on the battlements overlooking the sea. Wind whipped her hair into dark ribbons. Snow fell around her like accusations. You made enemies tonight, he said, joining her at the edge. I had enemies before tonight. She didn't look at him. Now they just know I'm paying attention. Thaddeus Crane has served Ravenspire for 20 years. Then he had 20 years to discover what I found in 3 days. Experience doesn't excuse incompetence. Cassian was quiet for a moment. You're going to transform this place. You said that already, because it's becoming more true every time I see you in action. He moved closer, not touching but close enough that she could feel the heat from his body cutting through the wind. Most noble women would have played the role I gave them, smiled at gatherings, produced heirs, stayed quiet during council meetings. Most noble women weren't married to survive their family's destruction. Seraphine finally turned to face him. You said you wanted time to prove you weren't my enemy, but you never asked what I wanted. What do you want? She considered the question, considered the man standing beside her who ruled like winter and protected like spring. Purpose. I want to matter beyond being ornamental. I want to use everything I learned surviving the aristocracy's contempt and actually accomplish something instead of just enduring. Done. Just like that? Just like that. Cassian's expression held something that might have been pride, if pride weren't such a vulnerable emotion to show. You're my Duchess. That means you have authority second only to mine. Use it. Transform Ravenspire into something that survives past both of us. And if I make mistakes, then we fix them. He reached out and brushed snow from her shoulder, the gesture almost tender. I didn't marry you to keep you locked away like treasure. I married you to stand beside me when the world inevitably tries to tear everything down. Why? She had to ask. Why go through all this? The manipulation, the debt clearing, the strategic positioning? You could have married anyone. Someone with a better bloodline, stronger political connections, more useful alliances. Why choose me? Cassian was silent for long enough that Seraphine thought he might not answer. Then, because you were the only person I watched navigate the court without becoming what it demanded. Everyone else either broke or transformed into something monstrous just to survive. You adapted. You learned. You became dangerous without becoming cruel. That's rarer than any bloodline, rarer than any alliance. His voice dropped lower. And I needed someone who could understand that monsters aren't born. They're made. One calculated decision at a time until you look in the mirror and don't recognize what's looking back. Are you asking me to understand you? I'm asking you not to fear me. Those aren't the same thing. No. He smiled, brief and devastating. But one leads to the other. Then Cassian Blackthorne did something that shattered every assumption Seraphine had built about him. He took her hand. Not possessively, not demanding. Just held it like it was something valuable that required care instead of conquest. The contact lasted maybe 10 seconds before he released her and stepped back. Sleep, Seraphine. Tomorrow, we deal with Duke Armand's inevitable retaliation. Tonight, you deserve to celebrate exposing a traitor and terrifying half my advisory council in a single meeting. He walked away before she could respond, leaving her standing in the snow with her heart doing complicated things that felt dangerously close to hope. That night, alone in her chambers, Seraphine made a discovery that would change everything. She'd been searching Cassian's study for additional financial records, trying to trace the full extent of Duke Armand's corruption. What she found instead was a hidden compartment beneath the writing desk, revealed when she accidentally triggered a panel while reaching for a ledger. Inside was a single leather-bound journal. She shouldn't have opened it. Privacy mattered, even in political marriages. But Seraphine had spent too many years learning that survival required information, and information required risks. So she opened it. The first entry was dated 4 years ago. Saw Lady Seraphine Vale at the Winter Masquerade tonight. 17 years old and already sharper than half the aristocracy. Watched her dismantle Lord Pemberton's trade proposal with 3 questions that exposed his entire scheme. She'll be dangerous if she survives. Seraphine's hand started shaking. She flipped through pages. Entry after entry. Observations, analysis, documentation of every time their paths had crossed at court functions, political gatherings, seasonal festivals. House Vale's debts are accelerating. At current rate, they'll lose everything within 2 years. Seraphine will be sold to whoever offers her father the most strategic advantage. Unacceptable. Arranged for anonymous payment of Vale family obligations through third-party intermediaries. Her father will never know the source. Neither will she. It's better that way. Her brother's gambling debts now exceed 50,000 gold. If discovered, scandal will destroy what remains of House Vale's credibility. Initiating intervention. Watched Seraphine manage 3 separate crisis situations at tonight's council reception. She's learned to survive by becoming indispensable instead of invisible. Intelligence as armor. That kind of strength doesn't come from privilege. It's forged in necessity. Page after page after page. 4 years of documentation. 4 years of calculated intervention. 4 years of a predator studying prey, except the predator was protecting instead of hunting. The final entry was dated 1 week before their wedding. Tomorrow I'll send the marriage proposal. House Vale has no leverage left to refuse. Seraphine will hate me for this. She'll see it as conquest, manipulation, another powerful man stealing her autonomy. She's not wrong, but I'd rather be the monster who cages her in protection than the saint who watches her be devoured by worse predators. At least this way, she survives. And maybe if I'm careful, she'll eventually understand that obsession isn't the same as ownership. Though I'm not sure I believe that distinction myself anymore. Seraphine closed the journal with hands that couldn't stop shaking. Cassian Blackthorne hadn't just wanted her. He'd been systematically protecting her for years, destroying her family's enemies, erasing obstacles, building a fortress around her before she even knew his name. And he'd done it all while maintaining a reputation as a monster so terrifying that no one would ever suspect Mercy lived beneath the armor. The door to her chamber burst open. Cassian stood in the doorway, still dressed for council meetings, his expression transforming from concern to something colder when he saw what she held in her hands. You found it. Seraphine couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. 4 years of surveillance, manipulation, and protection spread across the pages between her trembling fingers. I should have burned it, he said quietly. Should have destroyed the evidence years ago. But I couldn't. It was the only honest record of what I'd become. What you'd become, she finally found her voice. You've been controlling my life since I was 17 years old. I've been protecting your life. There's a difference. No, there isn't. Seraphine threw the journal across the room. It hit the wall and fell open, pages scattering like accusations. You destroyed people, manipulated alliances, turned me into a chess piece in whatever sick game you've been playing. I turned you into someone who survives. Cassian's control finally cracked. His voice rose, not with anger, but with something raw. Do you have any idea what would have happened if I hadn't intervened? House Vale was finished. Your father was one bad decision away from losing everything. Your brother was 2 months from debtor's prison. And you, brilliant and sharp as broken glass, would have been married off to whatever sadistic noble offered the highest bride price. So you decided to be that noble instead? I decided to be the monster who at least gave you options. He moved into the room, closing the distance between them. Duke Armand wanted you. So did Lord Pemberton. Half the aristocracy saw you as valuable property waiting to be claimed. The only reason they didn't was because I made it very clear that touching you meant war. Seraphine's breath came in short gasps. You had no right. I had every right the moment I decided you were mine to protect. The words hung in the air like smoke after artillery fire. Cassian's expression shifted from rage to something that looked dangerously close to devastation. He took a breath, forcing control back into his voice. I won't apologize for keeping you alive. I won't apologize for destroying people who saw you as conquest. And I won't apologize for building a cage that at least has the decency to look like freedom. You want honesty? Here it is. I've been obsessed with you since the first time I watched you survive something that should have broken you. And maybe that makes me a monster. Maybe it makes me the villain of this story. But at least you're still breathing to hate me for it. Silence. Just the sound of the fire crackling and the storm outside battering walls that had stood for 300 years. Seraphine looked at the journal pages scattered across the floor. 4 years of documentation. 4 years of a predator protecting prey while telling himself it was love instead of ownership. And the most terrifying part? She believed him. "Get out," she whispered. "Seraphine, get out of my room, now!" Cassian stood frozen for 3 seconds that felt like centuries. Then he turned and walked back through the connecting door, closing it behind him with a softness that somehow felt worse than slamming. Seraphine collapsed into the chair beside the fireplace, her entire body shaking. The Duke of Ravenspire had been watching her since she was 17, building her survival from the shadows. And she'd never suspected a thing until tonight. Outside, the storm grew stronger, waves crashing against the cliffs like the world itself was trying to tear everything apart. Inside, Seraphine sat in the darkness and tried to figure out if she'd just discovered evidence of love, or obsession so complete it had worn love's costume for 4 years without being caught. The morning after Seraphine discovered the journal, Ravenspire woke to silence that felt like waiting for an execution. Cassian stood in the war room reviewing troop movements that required immediate attention. Duke Armand's border reinforcements had escalated overnight. Supply lines were being rerouted. Military commanders were requesting authorization for preemptive strikes. Everything demanded his focus. He couldn't concentrate on any of it. His mind kept circling back to the look on Seraphine's face when she'd thrown his journal across the room. Not anger, not betrayal. Something worse. Understanding. She'd finally seen the complete architecture of what he'd built around her, and instead of gratitude, she'd looked at him like he was exactly what everyone had always said he was. A monster who dressed up obsession and called it protection. The door opened without knocking. Seraphine walked in wearing a riding dress the color of smoke, her hair pulled back with brutal efficiency. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. She looked like she hadn't slept. Neither had he. "We need to talk," she said. Cassian dismissed the advisors with a gesture. They fled. When the last one closed the door, silence filled the space between Duke and Duchess like floodwater rising. "You were 17, Seraphine began without preamble. 17 years old the first time you decided to interfere with my life. Do you understand how insane that is? I understand it's the only reason you survived to stand here and hate me for it. Don't." She moved closer, her voice dropping into something colder. "Don't justify this by pretending you saved me. You didn't save me, Cassian. You colonized me. Every choice I thought was mine, every path I thought I'd carved myself, you'd already paved it years in advance." Cassian set down the military reports and faced her directly. "You want me to apologize for keeping you alive? I want you to acknowledge that what you did was monstrous. I've never pretended otherwise." He kept his voice level, controlled, even though something was breaking apart beneath his ribs. "You knew what I was when you married me. You knew I was ruthless, manipulative, dangerous. The only thing that changed last night was your understanding of when the manipulation started." "The only thing that changed?" Seraphine's voice cracked slightly before she controlled it. "You've been orchestrating my entire existence since I was a child. That's not protection, that's ownership. Ownership implies property. I've never treated you as property. You've treated me as a project, a puzzle to be solved, a territory to be secured." She was close enough now that he could see the gold flecks in her eyes burning like embers. 4 years, Cassian. 4 years of surveillance, intervention, manipulation. And you never once considered that maybe I deserved to know the truth. Would you have believed me? What? If I'd approached you 2 years ago and said I'd been protecting your family anonymously, clearing your debts, destroying your enemies, would you have trusted me? Or would you have assumed I was exactly what everyone warned you I was? Seraphine opened her mouth, closed it. The silence stretched. Cassian pressed the advantage, even though it felt like driving knives into his own chest. "You would have run. You would have seen it as a threat, a trap, another predator circling wounded prey. So I did what predators do when they want something fragile to survive. I built a cage so carefully disguised as freedom that you never felt the bars until you were safe inside them. And now you know the truth." He moved closer, erasing the distance between them until they were close enough to share air. "Now you get to decide if survival with me is better than whatever waits outside these walls. Because I won't lie to you anymore, Seraphine. I won't pretend this started as anything noble. I wanted you. I took steps to ensure I could have you. Every single action I've taken for 4 years has been in service of that singular obsession." Her breath hitched. "That's not love. No. It's something more honest than love. Love pretends it's selfless. What I feel is entirely selfish. I want you alive. I want you beside me. I want every threat to your survival eliminated before it can touch you. That's not romance. That's possession wearing protection's costume. But at least I'm honest about what it is. Seraphine stared at him, something complicated moving behind her eyes. You're insane. Probably. Does that change anything? She should have left. Any sane person would have walked out and never looked back. But Seraphine Vale had spent 21 years learning that survival required calculated risks, and walking away from the Duke of Ravenspire meant walking back into a world that had already tried to devour her once. You don't get to make decisions for me anymore, she said finally. No more secret interventions, no more anonymous protection. If we're doing this, if I'm staying, then I need complete transparency. Every action, every plan, every threat. You tell me everything, or I walk out of Ravenspire and take my chances with whatever's waiting. Cassian studied her for 3 long seconds. Done. Just like that? Just like that. Though you should know that complete transparency includes the fact that I've already deployed soldiers to deal with Duke Armand's border provocations. By this time tomorrow, his supply lines will be disrupted and his military commanders will be receiving anonymous warnings that further aggression means total war. Seraphine's eyes widened. You're escalating to military conflict? I'm responding proportionally to economic warfare that's been ongoing for months. He walked to the map table and gestured to markers showing troop positions. Armand thought he could steal from Ravenspire without consequences because previous dukes allowed it. I'm correcting that assumption. By starting a war? By ending theft with sufficient force that no one attempts it again. He looked at her directly. This is what ruling looks like when you're committed to survival over popularity. Armand will back down or he'll be destroyed. There's no third option. Seraphine moved to the map, studying the positions with the same intensity she'd applied to financial ledgers. If you disrupt his supply lines, you'll destabilize trade through the southern territories. Merchants who've done nothing wrong will suffer. Acceptable collateral damage. No. She looked up, her expression hardening. It's not acceptable. If we're punishing Armand, we target him specifically. We don't burn down innocent lives just to prove a point. Cassian felt something that might have been admiration crack through his frustration. You want to fight a war with precision instead of overwhelming force? I want to fight a war that doesn't create more enemies than it eliminates. She traced a different route on the map. His grain storage is concentrated here, in the eastern warehouses. Destroy those, and you cripple his ability to sustain military operations without touching civilian trade routes. You've been studying military strategy. I've been studying survival. Same thing. For the first time since the journal incident, Cassian felt the tension between them shift from confrontation into something that resembled partnership. You're right. Precision is more effective than spectacle. Seraphine looked genuinely surprised. You're agreeing with me? I'm acknowledging superior tactics. He marked the eastern warehouses on the map. We'll hit Armand's infrastructure directly. Civilians remain untouched. Satisfied? For now. She hesitated, then, why did you really show me Thornfield? What? The village. Taking me to see the northern territories, showing me how you protect people in secret. Why? Because I needed you to understand that monsters come in different configurations. He kept his voice carefully neutral. Everyone sees the brutality. No one looks deeper to ask why it exists. I wanted you to see both sides before you decided whether staying was survivable. And if I'd decided it wasn't, then I would have let you go. Liar? Maybe. He smiled, brief and sharp. But you'll never know for certain, will you? Because you stayed. Seraphine held his gaze for a long moment. I stayed because walking away meant admitting defeat. Don't mistake strategy for acceptance. I wouldn't dare. The door burst open. Lord Thaddeus Crane stood in the doorway, his expression grim. Your Grace, we have a problem. Us. The problem arrived in the form of Lady Lenora Whitfeld and an entourage that could only be described as an invasion disguised as a social visit. She swept into Ravenspire's main hall with 6 attendants, 4 guards, and enough luggage to suggest she planned on staying until spring. Her smile could have cut glass. Her eyes assessed everything like she was calculating property value. Duke Cassian, she purred, approaching with hands extended. I hope you'll forgive the unexpected visit. When I heard about the delightful developments in your household, I simply had to come congratulate the happy couple personally. Cassian stood at the top of the hall's entrance stairs, Seraphine beside him, both of them dressed for court appearances. He didn't move to take Lenora's offered hands. Lady Whitfeld, to what do we actually owe this intrusion? Lenora's smile sharpened. Intrusion? I'm wounded, Your Grace. I merely wish to offer counsel to your new Duchess. The transition from minor nobility to ruling the North can be so overwhelming. I thought perhaps my experience might prove valuable. How generous, Seraphine said, her voice carrying just enough acid to etch steel. Though I'm curious what experience you're offering. How to manipulate trade routes? How to poison rooms with false concern? How to threaten new wives under the guise of mentorship? The hall went silent. Lenora's attendants looked scandalized. Her guards shifted uncomfortably. Even Cassian's own advisors, standing along the walls, seemed uncertain whether they should intervene or simply watch the carnage unfold. Lenora recovered with impressive speed. My dear child, I see you've inherited your husband's charming directness. How refreshing. She turned her attention back to Cassian. I actually came to discuss matters of mutual interest. Duke Armand's border reinforcements have concerned several southern houses. We hope to establish a unified response. By we, you mean the coalition you've been building for the past month, specifically to challenge Ravenspire's authority? Seraphine descended 3 steps, closing distance like a weapon being deployed. Yes, we're aware of your correspondence with Armand, your meetings with Lord Pemberton, and your attempts to convince Eastern territories that the Duke's marriage represents weakness to be exploited. Lenora's composure cracked slightly. I don't know what you think you've discovered. What I've discovered is that you've been coordinating economic pressure against Ravenspire while pretending to maintain diplomatic relations. Seraphine reached the bottom step, now at eye level with the older woman. You thought the new Duchess would be decorative, manageable, and too inexperienced to notice your maneuvering. You were wrong on all 3 counts. Cassian watched his wife dismantle a woman who'd been playing political games since before Seraphine was born and felt something dangerous settle in his chest. Not quite pride, not quite possession. Something that combined both into a feeling he didn't have vocabulary for. Lady Lenora, he said quietly, drawing everyone's attention, you have 2 options. You can leave Ravenspire immediately and return to your estate, where you'll cease all coordination with Duke Armand and his coalition. Or you can remain here while I compile formal charges of conspiracy, which I will present to the king along with evidence that will see you stripped of title and territory. You wouldn't dare, Lenora hissed. My family has served the crown for generations. Your family has served your family. Cassian descended the stairs until he stood beside Seraphine, a united front that probably looked terrifying to anyone with functioning survival instincts. And right now your interests conflict with Ravenspire's survival. That makes you a threat. I eliminate threats. It's what I'm famous for. Lenora looked between them, calculating odds that weren't in her favor. The Duke's reputation preceded him. The new Duchess had just proved herself equally dangerous. Retreat was the only logical option. You'll regret this, she said, venom barely concealed. Both of you. Probably, Seraphine agreed pleasantly. Add it to the list. Now leave before my husband stops being diplomatic and starts being honest. Lenora Whitfeld swept out of the hall with her entourage scrambling to follow. The doors closed behind them with a sound like artillery fire. The advisors remained frozen along the walls. Cassian turned to look at Seraphine, at this woman who'd just faced down one of the most dangerous political operators in the kingdom without flinching. You enjoyed that, immensely. She was still watching the door. Though we've just made a significant enemy. We had that enemy long before today. He moved closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. You're transforming into something terrifying. Good. She looked up at him, gold-flecked eyes burning. Maybe I need to be terrifying to survive standing next to you. Maybe you were always terrifying. I just gave you permission to stop hiding it. The moment stretched between them, heavy with implications neither was ready to examine too closely. Then Thaddeus Crane cleared his throat. Your Grace, Duke Armand has sent formal demands. He's requesting reparations for what he calls unlawful interference with his trade operations. If we don't comply within 3 days, he's threatening military action. Cassian didn't look away from Seraphine. Send him my response. No reparations. No negotiations. If he wants war, we'll give him something that looks like extinction. That night, Seraphine found Cassian on the battlements where snow fell like silent ammunition, and the sea below sounded like it was trying to destroy the world one wave at a time. "You're escalating," she said, joining him at the edge. "I'm responding." There's a difference between response and annihilation. Not when the threat is existential. He didn't look at her, just kept staring out at darkness punctuated by distant lightning. "Armand thinks he can challenge Ravenspire because he believes my marriage made me vulnerable. He thinks love is weakness. I need to correct that assumption before every house in the kingdom decides to test the theory. By proving you're still a monster? By proving I'm a more dangerous monster when I have something worth protecting." He finally turned to face her. "You want honesty? Here it is. Every threat to you makes me colder. Every attempt to undermine Ravenspire makes me more surgical. I don't become gentle when I care about something. I become unstoppable." Seraphine felt her breath catch. "That's not sustainable. It's the only thing that's ever worked, until it doesn't." She moved closer, close enough to see exhaustion carved into his features. "You can't fight the entire kingdom, Cassian." Eventually, overwhelming force creates overwhelming opposition. "Then what do you suggest?" "Alliance." She pulled a document from inside her coat. "I've been corresponding with houses that have no love for Duke Armand. If we can build a coalition against him, we isolate the threat instead of fighting everyone simultaneously." Cassian took the document and read it by torchlight. When he finished, he looked at her with something that might have been awe, if awe weren't such a vulnerable emotion. "You've been conducting your own diplomatic campaign. Someone needs to think strategically while you're planning military annihilation." She took the document back. "Armand has enemies. We leverage those enemies. Make him the villain instead of you." "I am the villain." "Yes, but you're our villain. There's a difference." The possessive pronoun hung in the air between them. "Our villain, not the villain. Our—" Cassian reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face with one hand. His thumb traced her cheekbone with surprising gentleness. "You're reshaping everything. Someone has to." She didn't pull away from his touch. "You've spent so long surviving alone that you've forgotten survival works better with partnership. Partnership implies equality. Then consider this equality." She covered his hand with hers. "I stay. I fight beside you. I transform Ravenspire into something that survives past both of us. But you stop making unilateral decisions about threats and warfare. We strategize together, or I walk out of this fortress, and you can face Armand's coalition alone. You're negotiating terms. I'm establishing boundaries. If this marriage is going to be anything other than captivity, I need autonomy. Not freedom. Autonomy. The difference matters." Cassian studied her for a long moment. This woman who kept surprising him by refusing to be what anyone expected, including him. Agreed. Full transparency. Joint decision-making, partnership instead of possession. Liar. He smiled, sharp and honest. "Probably, but I'll try." Seraphine rose on her toes and kissed him. It wasn't passionate, wasn't desperate, just a deliberate choice made by someone who decided that surviving beside a monster was better than being devoured by worse predators. When she pulled back, Cassian's eyes had darkened into something dangerous. "Don't start something you're not prepared to finish," he said quietly. "Who says I'm not prepared?" They stood on the battlements while snow fell, and the sea crashed, and something fundamental shifted between Duke and Duchess. Not love, not yet, but recognition that partnership could be more dangerous than possession if both participants understood the rules. The war came faster than anyone expected. Duke Armand's patience lasted exactly 48 hours after Seraphine's diplomatic maneuvering cut through his coalition like surgical strikes. Houses that had promised support suddenly remembered previous obligations. Trade routes that should have isolated Ravenspire mysteriously reopened. Military commanders who'd pledged loyalty to Armand started receiving better offers from the north. Seraphine's strategy was working, which meant Armand had to act before he lost all leverage. The attack happened at dawn. Soldiers wearing Armand's colors stormed the southern border villages, burning grain stores and killing anyone who resisted. 3 settlements destroyed before Ravenspire's scouts could send warnings. Civilians executed, children left orphaned. Everything designed to provoke Cassian into responding with overwhelming force that would justify calling him the monster the kingdom feared. It was psychological warfare wrapped in atrocity, and it was spectacularly effective. Cassian stood in the war room reading casualty reports with hands that didn't shake, even though something was breaking apart behind his ribs. 47 dead. Over 100 wounded. Villages that had been under his protection were now smoking ruins. He'd failed them. "Your Grace," Thaddeus said carefully, "we need to respond. If we don't retaliate immediately, every house in the kingdom will interpret it as weakness." Cassian set down the reports. "Assemble the northern divisions. Full deployment. We march on Armand's territory within the hour." "That's exactly what he wants," Seraphine said from the doorway. Everyone turned. She walked into the room wearing riding clothes and an expression that could cut through armor. "He's baiting you into responding with overwhelming force so he can claim self-defense and rally support from houses that fear your reputation. If you burn his territory, you prove every fear they have about you. He burned mine first." Cassian's voice was colder than winter. "He killed civilians under my protection. That demands response. It demands justice, not vengeance." She moved to the map table. "If you want to destroy Armand, you do it strategically. You expose him as the aggressor. You prove he targeted innocent villages to provoke exactly this reaction. Then you let the king's court decide his punishment. The king's court will spend months deliberating while Armand reinforces his position. Then we don't wait for them." Seraphine traced routes on the map. "We hit his command structure directly, capture his military commanders, seize his war planning documents, compile evidence of his atrocities. Then we present it to every house in the kingdom and let them decide if they want to be associated with a man who burns children alive. That's not vengeance. That's politics. Politics is how you win wars without creating martyrs." She looked up at him, at this man who wanted to burn the world down for daring to threaten what he protected. "I understand you're angry. I understand 47 deaths feel like personal failure. But if you respond the way Armand expects, you transform yourself into the monster everyone fears instead of the ruler they respect." Cassian was silent for 10 seconds that felt like centuries. Then, "Do it." He looked at his advisors. "Full intelligence operation. I want Armand's command structure exposed within 3 days. No civilian casualties. Surgical precision." Thaddeus looked stunned. "Your Grace, with respect, intelligence operations take weeks. Then work faster." Cassian's voice cut through objections like a blade. "My wife just offered a strategy that turns Armand's atrocity into his own execution. We implement it perfectly, or we prove she was right to doubt my judgment." The advisors scrambled to adapt. When they were alone, Seraphine approached Cassian with careful steps. "You listened to me. You were right." He still wouldn't look at her. "I wanted to burn his territory until nothing remained. I wanted to make sure no one ever dared touch what belongs to me again. But that would have made me exactly what everyone says I am. You are what everyone says you are." She touched his arm, gentle contact that somehow felt more intimate than anything they'd shared before. "You're just also more than that. The trick is remembering which part to show when." Cassian finally looked at her, this woman who kept pulling him back from edges he'd spent years learning to jump from without hesitation. "How do you do that? Do what?" "Make me want to be something other than survival personified." Seraphine smiled, small and devastating. "I don't. I just remind you that survival works better when you're not the only thing left standing in the ashes." So, the intelligence operation took 5 days instead of 3. 5 days of coordinated strikes against Armand's infrastructure, command posts infiltrated, documents seized, military commanders captured alive and interrogated with methods that were brutal but left no physical evidence of torture. Seraphine watched Cassian work with the efficiency of someone who'd spent decades learning how to dismantle enemies without leaving witnesses. He was terrifying. He was also scrupulously precise about avoiding civilian casualties. Every target was military. Every strike was documented. When Armand's own soldiers started deserting after discovering their duke had ordered attacks on defenseless villages, Cassian offered them amnesty in exchange for testimony. Within a week, the evidence was overwhelming. Duke Armand had initiated aggression. Duke Armand had targeted civilians. Duke Armand had violated every rule of engagement that separated warfare from atrocity. And Duke Cassian Blackthorn had responded with restraint that shocked the entire kingdom. The court summons arrived from the capital, demanding both dukes present their cases before the king. "This is it," Seraphine said, reviewing the summons in Cassian's study. If we present the evidence correctly, Armand will be stripped of title and territory. Your reputation shifts from monster to defender. And if we present it incorrectly, then we both get executed for treason and Ravenspire burns while nobles argue about who gets to claim the ruins. She looked up at him. No pressure. Cassian moved to the window, looking out at the fortress that had been in his family for 3 centuries. I'm not good at court politics. I'm good at violence that ends arguments permanently. Then it's fortunate you married someone who's good at both. Seraphine joined him at the window. We go to the capital together. You intimidate. I navigate. Between us, maybe we survive this. You make survival sound romantic. It's the only romance I know how to offer. He turned to face her, this woman who'd transformed from captive to partner in less than 2 months. When this is over, when Armand is destroyed and Ravenspire is secure, I want to tell you something. Tell me now. No, not until you have the freedom to walk away if you choose to. He reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture achingly tender. I won't trap you with confessions when escape might not be survivable. That would be just another cage. Seraphine felt her breath catch. You're learning. I'm trying. Doesn't come naturally. I know. That's why it matters. They stood in the firelight, 2 predators who'd learned that survival sometimes required vulnerability more dangerous than any weapon. Then the door burst open. Lord Thaddeus Crane stood in the doorway, his face pale. Your Grace, we have a catastrophic problem. Lady Lenora Whitfield has been found dead in her estate, poisoned, and evidence is pointing directly at Ravenspire as the source. Cassian's expression went glacial. Explain. The poison used matches compounds from our medical supplies. A letter was found in her chambers, supposedly from you, threatening her life if she didn't cease opposition to your rule. He held up a document sealed with what looked like Cassian's personal crest. It's a forgery, but a perfect one. And Duke Armand is already circulating reports that you had her murdered to silence political opposition. Seraphine felt her world tilt. This is a setup. Obviously. Cassian's voice was dead calm in the way that preceded violence. Armand knew he was losing the court battle, so he manufactured a crime that makes me look like exactly what everyone fears, a tyrant who kills political opponents. The timing is perfect, Thaddeus continued. You're supposed to appear before the king in 3 days. Now you'll be answering murder charges instead of presenting evidence against Armand. Can we prove the forgery? Seraphine demanded. Not quickly enough. The seal is perfect. The handwriting matches your Grace's style. Whoever created this knew Ravenspire's internal systems intimately. Cassian turned to look at her, and Seraphine saw something in his eyes that made her blood freeze. This isn't just about Armand anymore, he said quietly. Someone inside Ravenspire betrayed us. Someone with access to my personal seal, my correspondence style, our medical supplies. We have a traitor in the fortress. The implications crashed through the room like artillery fire. If they couldn't trust their own household, they couldn't trust anyone. If they couldn't prove the forgery, Cassian would be executed for murder. And if Cassian died, Ravenspire would fall. Seraphine looked at her husband, this man who'd spent 4 years protecting her from shadows, and made a decision that would either save them both or destroy everything. Then we find the traitor, she said. And we make sure Duke Armand learns what happens when you try to destroy a monster by proving he's exactly what everyone feared. How? By becoming what everyone fears. She moved to the map table, her mind already calculating strategies that would have horrified her 6 months ago. If they want a monster, we give them one. But we make sure the teeth are pointed at the right throat. Cassian watched his wife transform into something dangerous, something that matched him in brutality and surpassed him in strategy, and felt the last wall between them shatter completely. This was it, the point of no return. Either they survived together by becoming more ruthless than their enemies could anticipate, or they burned together while the kingdom celebrated the monster's fall. There was no third option. Not anymore. The hunt for the traitor began in silence that felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, waiting to see who'd push first. Cassian locked down Ravenspire with efficiency that would have impressed military commanders across 3 kingdoms. No one entered. No one left. Guards were rotated every 4 hours to prevent coordination. Servants were confined to specific wings. Advisors found themselves under surveillance by soldiers they'd never seen before, men whose loyalty ran deeper than titles or gold. Seraphine moved through the fortress like smoke, watching everything, cataloging reactions, measuring fear. Because fear told stories. Innocent people showed confusion when locked down without explanation. Guilty people showed calculation. She was looking for calculation. They started with Marcus Brennan. The former steward sat in a cell beneath the fortress where stone walls sweated moisture and torches cast shadows that looked like accusations. He'd been the first traitor they'd discovered, the obvious suspect when another betrayal surfaced. But Cassian didn't believe in obvious. He stood outside the cell while Seraphine conducted the interrogation. Not because he lacked skill in extracting information, because watching his wife work revealed things about her he was still learning to process. "Marcus," Seraphine said, her voice carrying the kind of calm that preceded executions. "Someone used the Duke's personal seal to forge correspondence. Someone with intimate knowledge of how Ravenspire operates internally. You've served this house for 15 years. You know everyone, every system, every weakness." Marcus looked up from where he sat on the stone bench, his face haggard. "Lady Seraphine, I swear on my children's lives, I had nothing to do with Lady Whitfeld's death. Yes, I betrayed the Duke's trust with the grain embezzlement. Yes, I deserve punishment. But murder? Framing his grace for assassination? I would never." "Then tell me who would." "I don't know." "You're lying." Marcus's hand shook. "I'm not lying. I'm terrified." He stood up, moving to the bars. "Whoever did this is 10 times smarter than me. They knew exactly how to make the forgery perfect. They knew which poison to use. They knew the Duke's communication patterns well enough to replicate them flawlessly. That kind of access requires trust. Real trust. Not someone like me who the Duke kept at arm's length even after 15 years of service." Seraphine studied him for a long moment. Outside the cell, Cassian watched her process information the way generals processed battlefield intelligence. Fast, cold, accurate. "You're right," she said finally. "This isn't you. You're not smart enough to pull this off." Marcus looked offended and relieved simultaneously. "But you know who is," Seraphine continued. "You've watched this household for 15 years. You've seen who has genuine access to the Duke, who he trusts enough to let close. So I'm going to ask you one more time, and if you lie, I will personally ensure your family loses everything they have left. Who in Ravenspire could forge that seal?" Marcus was silent for 30 seconds that felt like drowning. Then, "Lord Thaddeus Crane." The words hit like artillery fire. Cassian's expression didn't change, but Seraphine saw his hands curl into fists behind his back. "Thaddeus has served me for 20 years, Cassian said quietly. "He fought beside my father. He helped me take back Ravenspire after the coup. You're accusing the most loyal man in this fortress." "I'm telling you the truth," Marcus said, desperation bleeding into his voice. "Thaddeus has access to everything. Your seal, your correspondence, your medical supplies. He coordinates all military operations. He knows your writing style better than anyone because he drafts half your official communications. If someone wanted to forge your identity, he's the only person with comprehensive enough access to make it perfect." Seraphine looked at Cassian through the cell bars. "When was the last time you personally verified your seal's location?" Cassian's jaw tightened. 3 weeks ago. "And since then?" "Thaddeus has been managing all official correspondence while I focused on the Armand situation." The silence that followed was broken only by water dripping somewhere in the darkness. It couldn't be Thaddeus. The man had bled for House Blackthorn, had stood beside Cassian during battles that should have killed them both, had been the one constant in a world where loyalty was currency and betrayal was epidemic. But perfect loyalty was also perfect camouflage. "We need proof," Seraphine said. "Accusations aren't enough. If we move against Thaddeus without evidence, we destroy morale and potentially eliminate our only genuine ally." "Then we create a trap," Cassian replied. "We feed him information that only a traitor would act on, and we see what he does with it." The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Cassian called an emergency council meeting in the war room. Only his closest advisors attended. Thaddeus Crane, William Graves, Helena Voss, the fortress's master of intelligence, 6 others whose positions required absolute trust. Cassian stood at the head of the table where maps showed territories and threats in equal measure. "We have 48 hours before the king demands our presence in the capital. Duke Armand's assassination setup is perfect. Unless we can prove the forgery, I will be executed for Lenora Whitfeld's murder, and Ravenspire falls." The advisors shifted uncomfortably. However, Cassian continued, I've discovered new evidence. A witness who saw someone leaving Lady Whitfeld's estate the night of her death. Someone wearing Ravenspire colors. He pulled out a fabricated document that looked official. The witness is being held in the Eastern Watchtower under maximum security. Tomorrow at dawn, Lady Seraphine and I will travel there personally to secure testimony. This witness could exonerate me completely. It was a lie. Every word calculated to provoke action. Because if Thaddeus was the traitor, he now knew exactly where the Duke and Duchess would be at dawn. Vulnerable. Outside the fortress's primary defenses. Perfect targets for assassination disguised as Duke Armand's retaliation. After the meeting, Thaddeus approached Cassian with concern, etched into features that looked like granite. Your Grace, traveling outside Ravenspire right now is dangerous. Let me send soldiers to retrieve this witness instead. No, Cassian said. If this testimony is as valuable as the reports suggest, I won't risk it being compromised during transport. Seraphine and I leave at first light. Thaddeus looked troubled. Then at least take a full military escort. 2 guards. Any more draws attention we can't afford. Cassian clasped Thaddeus on the shoulder, the gesture of a commander trusting his oldest friend. You'll command the fortress while we're gone. If something happens to us, Ravenspire needs someone who understands how to maintain order. Thaddeus's expression flickered with something Cassian couldn't read. Of course, Your Grace. I'll guard Ravenspire with my life. I know you will. They parted. Seraphine waited until they were alone in Cassian's study before speaking. If he's innocent, we just terrified a loyal man. If he's guilty, we just told him exactly how to kill us both. Yes, Cassian moved to the hidden compartment where weapons lived alongside documents too dangerous to leave unprotected. So now we see which scenario unfolds. And if we're wrong, if Thaddeus is genuine and someone else is the traitor, then we've wasted our last chance to identify the real threat, and we walk into the capital tomorrow completely exposed. He pulled out a blade that looked like it had tasted blood recently. But I don't think we're wrong. Marcus was terrified. Real terror. The kind you can't fake. And everything he said about access and capability points to Thaddeus. Seraphina moved to the window, watching snow fall over battlements that suddenly felt less like protection and more like a cage. 20 years of loyalty. 20 years of service. What breaks that? Money, Cassian said. Ideology? Revenge? Take your pick. Men betray for hundreds of reasons, but it usually comes down to wanting something they can't have while remaining loyal. What could Thaddeus possibly want that you haven't already given him? Power that doesn't require answering to anyone. He set the blade on the table. I'm the Duke. He's the commander who never gets to rule. That breeds resentment eventually. Maybe Duke Armand offered him Ravenspire's military command once I'm executed. Maybe he's been planning this for years, waiting for the right moment. Or maybe we're wrong, and we're about to destroy an innocent man's reputation. Maybe. Cassian looked at her directly. Does that change what we need to do? Seraphine held his gaze. No. Survival requires ruthlessness. You taught me that. I'm starting to regret how well you learned. Good. She moved closer. You should regret creating a monster who matches you in brutality. Makes us both more dangerous. Also makes us both more likely to get killed. That too. They stood in the firelight. 2 predators who'd learned that trust was the most dangerous weapon in anyone's arsenal because it required vulnerability that could be exploited by anyone smart enough to recognize the weakness. Tomorrow we find out if 20 years of loyalty was real or performance, Cassian said quietly. And if it was performance, I'm going to show Thaddeus exactly what happens when you betray the Duke of Ravenspire. What happens? I stop being the controlled monster everyone fears and become the uncontrolled one everyone should have feared more. Dawn came cold and sharp as broken glass. Cassian and Seraphine left Ravenspire through the southern gate with exactly 2 guards as promised. Both men were loyal to the point of suicidal. Both had been briefed on the real mission. They weren't traveling to the Eastern Watchtower. They were traveling 3 miles down the coastal road to a position where ambush would be tactically ideal. High cliffs on one side, dense forest on the other, limited visibility, perfect killing ground. If Thaddeus was the traitor, this is where he'd strike. The road wound through snow-covered terrain that looked beautiful until you remembered beauty didn't stop arrows or blades. Seraphine rode beside Cassian, her posture relaxed in a way that required discipline. Fear was natural. Showing fear was fatal. "You're quiet," Cassian observed. "I'm calculating how many different ways we can die in the next hour." Optimistic count or realistic? Realistic. And 12, possibly 15 if they're creative. She glanced at him. "You?" 23. He smiled, brief and sharp. "I've been doing this longer." "That's not comforting. It's not meant to be." They reached the ambush point exactly 1 hour after leaving the fortress. The forest pressed close on both sides. Cliffs dropped away to rocks and ocean below. Wind carried snow that reduced visibility to maybe 30 feet. Perfect conditions for murder. Cassian raised his hand. The small group stopped. Nothing moved except snow falling and waves crashing. Then arrows erupted from the tree line like a swarm of mechanical insects. The first guard died instantly, 3 arrows punching through armor that should have protected him. The second guard managed to raise his shield before taking a bolt through the throat. He made a wet choking sound and collapsed. Cassian and Seraphine dove from their horses as more arrows filled the space where they'd been sitting seconds before. They hit the snow hard, rolling toward the cliff edge where rocky outcroppings provided minimal cover. Soldiers emerged from the forest. 12 men wearing nondescript armor that could belong to any house. Professional killers hired to leave no connection to whoever ordered the hit. But Cassian recognized military efficiency when he saw it. Ravenspire soldiers. Thaddeus's men. He felt something crack inside his chest. Not surprise, something colder. The final death of hope he'd been carrying without realizing it. 20 years of loyalty had been 20 years of planning. The soldiers advanced with textbook precision. Spreading out. Cutting off escape routes. Moving to surround and eliminate. Cassian pulled the blade from beneath his coat and looked at Seraphine. "When I move, you run for the horse path down the cliff. Don't stop, don't look back." "No. That wasn't a request. And I don't follow orders from men who think I need protecting." She pulled her own blade, smaller but equally deadly. "We fight together or we die together. Choose." The soldiers were 20 feet away. Cassian chose. He exploded forward with violence that would have made battlefield commanders reconsider their career choices. The first soldier died before he could raise his sword, Cassian's blade opening his throat in a movement too fast to track. The second lost his hand. The third took a knife to the eye socket. Seraphine moved like she'd been trained for exactly this scenario, which she hadn't. She'd been trained to survive ballrooms and political maneuvering, but survival required adaptation, and she'd learned to adapt. She killed the fourth soldier by driving her blade up through his jaw while he was focused on Cassian. Not elegant, not honorable, just effective. The fight lasted 90 seconds. When it ended, 8 soldiers were dead or dying. 4 had fled back into the forest. And Cassian stood in snow turned red with blood that steamed in the cold air. Seraphine was breathing hard, her hands shaking, her dress soaked with gore that wasn't hers. "You learned to fight," Cassian said. "Not quite a question." "I learned to survive." She wiped blood from her face with a hand that trembled despite her efforts to control it. Turns out they're the same skill. One of the dying soldiers coughed wetly. Cassian knelt beside him, blade pressed to the man's throat. "Who ordered this?" The soldier's eyes were glazing over. "Thaddeus," said the Duke had gone soft. "Said new leadership was coming. We were promised land. Titles." He coughed blood. "Weren't supposed to miss." "You didn't miss." Cassian's voice was empty of everything except cold mathematics. "I let you hit what I wanted you to hit. Who else is involved?" The soldier tried to answer, failed, died. Cassian stood up slowly, his entire body vibrating with something that looked like rage, but felt colder. "Thaddeus. 20 years. 20 fucking years. We need to get back to Ravenspire," Seraphine said. "If he's betraying you, he's probably moving to seize the fortress while we're gone. He won't seize it." Cassian started walking back toward the horses. "He'll defend it. Make himself look like the loyal commander protecting the Duke's territory, while the Duke is mysteriously killed by Duke Armand's assassins. Then he'll accept a promotion from whoever's backing him, probably Armand himself. Then we're walking into a fortress controlled by our enemy. Yes." He mounted his horse, movements mechanical. "And we're going to take it back the same way I took it back when I was 13, by being more brutal than anyone expects." "Cassian, no!" He looked at her, and Seraphine saw something in his eyes that made her blood freeze. No more strategy, no more precision, no more pretending I'm anything other than what I've always been. Thaddeus wanted to remove the monster from power, so I'm going to show him exactly why the monster stayed in power for 20 years. They reached Ravenspire 2 hours later. The fortress looked normal. Guards on the walls, smoke rising from chimneys, everything operating exactly as it should, which meant Thaddeus was confident the assassination had succeeded. Cassian and Seraphine approached the main gate, where sentries stood at attention. One of them, a young soldier named Willem, looked shocked. "Your Grace, we weren't expecting you back so soon." "Change of plans," Cassian said casually. "Where's Lord Thaddeus?" "In the war room, my lord. He's been coordinating defensive positions in case Duke Armand retaliates for—" Willem stopped, clearly uncertain how much to say. "For my death?" Cassian smiled. "Cold as winter. Don't worry, Willem. I'm aware that my loyal commander thinks I'm currently bleeding out on the coastal road." He dismounted and handed over the reins. "Let us in, and have the gate sealed behind us. No one else enters or leaves without my personal authorization." Willem's face went pale. "Your Grace, I don't understand, but—" "You don't need to understand. You need to follow orders. Gate sealed. Now." "Yes, Your Grace." "Yes. Cassian and Seraphine walked into Ravenspire like they were walking into enemy territory. Because they were. Every soldier they passed could be loyal to Thaddeus. Every servant could be reporting their movements. The fortress they'd called home was now a battlefield where identifying enemies required guessing correctly before the first strike. When they reached the war room, Cassian didn't knock. He kicked the door open with enough force to send it crashing into the wall. Thaddeus Crane stood at the map table with 4 other officers, reviewing what looked like defensive formations. His head snapped up. His face went through 3 distinct expressions in 2 seconds. Surprise, fear, calculation. "Your Grace," he said, recovering with impressive speed. "Thank God you're safe. We received reports of an ambush on the coastal road." "You received reports because you ordered the ambush," Cassian interrupted. He walked into the room like he owned it, which he did. Though ownership was currently disputed by the man who'd spent 20 years pretending loyalty while planning coup. "How many soldiers do you have positioned to seize the fortress once I was confirmed dead?" Thaddeus's hand moved toward the sword at his hip. "Don't," Seraphine said quietly. She'd moved to flank Cassian, her own blade visible. "You're outmatched, outmaneuvered, and out of time. Answer the question." Thaddeus looked between them, his mind clearly racing through options that were all bad. Finally, he lowered his hand. 40 men, positioned in key locations throughout Ravenspire. 1 signal from me, and they take control of the gates, the armory, and the treasury. "Efficient," Cassian observed. "I'm almost impressed. What was the offer? What did Duke Armand promise you that was worth betraying everything?" Thaddeus's expression hardened. "He didn't promise me anything. I approached him, offered an alliance to remove you from power." "Why?" "Because you're a monster," Thaddeus said, venom finally bleeding through the diplomatic facade. "Because for 20 years I've watched you rule through fear and brutality. Because you've turned Ravenspire into a fortress of horror, where everyone lives in terror of your next decision. And then you married that woman," he gestured towards Seraphine with disgust. "And suddenly, everyone's supposed to believe you're redeemable? That love makes you less dangerous?" "It doesn't," Seraphine said. "It makes him more dangerous. You just didn't understand the difference. I understand that he's a threat to the stability of the entire kingdom." Thaddeus moved around the table, his officers backing him up. "I understand that someone needed to remove him before he started the kind of war that gets thousands killed. So yes, I arranged Lenora Whitfeld's assassination and framed him for it. Yes, I coordinated with Duke Armand to create the perfect trap. And yes, I was going to rule Ravenspire the way it should have been ruled all along. With justice instead of terror." "Justice," Cassian repeated. "You poisoned a woman, framed me for murder, sent soldiers to kill your own duchess. And you're calling it justice?" "I'm calling it necessary sacrifice." Thaddeus drew his sword. The other officers followed suit. "Sometimes good men have to do terrible things to prevent worse things from happening. You taught me that." The room fell silent. 4 armed men facing a duke and duchess who were outnumbered but had survived worse odds already today. Cassian looked at Thaddeus, at this man he'd trusted for 2 decades and felt the last piece of humanity he'd been protecting shatter completely. "You want to see the monster?" he said quietly. "You want to see what happens when I stop pretending restraint matters?" Then he moved. What happened next wasn't a fight. It was butchery disguised as combat. Cassian killed the first officer before the man could raise his blade. The second died trying to protect Thaddeus. The third managed one swing before Cassian broke his arm and drove a knife through his skull. Seraphine took the fourth by surprise, her blade opening his throat while he was distracted by Cassian's violence. In 15 seconds, 3 men were dead, and Thaddeus stood alone, his sword shaking in his hand. "You're right," Cassian said, walking toward him slowly. "I am a monster. I have always been a monster. The only question was whether I'd use that to protect Ravenspire or destroy it. You just made sure I don't have to choose anymore." He disarmed Thaddeus with a movement that broke 2 fingers and sent the sword clattering across stone. Thaddeus fell to his knees, cradling his hand. "You're going to kill me." "No!" Cassian knelt beside him, his voice dropping to something that barely qualified as human. "Killing you is mercy. And you just taught me that mercy is weakness. So instead, I'm going to make an example of what happens when you betray the Duke of Ravenspire. You wanted justice? Here's justice." He stood up and looked at Seraphine. His eyes were empty of everything except cold purpose. She recognized that expression. It was the same one he wore when deciding which villages received secret aid and which enemies disappeared permanently. The expression of a man who'd learned that survival required calculations that civilized people couldn't make without breaking. "Find the 40 soldiers Thaddeus positioned throughout the fortress," Cassian said. "Offer them one chance to surrender and confess their involvement. Anyone who refuses gets executed in the main courtyard at sunset. Anyone who cooperates gets prison instead of death. And Thaddeus? He lives, but not the way he wants to." Cassian looked down at the man who'd betrayed him. "You wanted to prove I was a monster. Congratulations. You succeeded. Now you get to watch what happens when monsters stop pretending to be anything else." Mas. The purge happened with surgical precision. Seraphine coordinated the identification and arrest of every soldier involved in Thaddeus's coup. 27 surrendered immediately when confronted with evidence. 13 resisted and died in brief violent confrontations throughout the fortress. By sunset, Ravenspire's main courtyard had become a public tribunal. The entire household was assembled. Servants, soldiers, advisors. Everyone who served House Blackthorn stood in the snow while Cassian addressed them from the steps of the Great Hall. 20 years ago, he began, his voice carrying across the courtyard without needing to shout, "I took back this fortress from family members who murdered my father and tried to claim his territory through violence. I was 13 years old. I hung their bodies from the battlements and let them rot until nothing remained but bones and warning. I did this because I learned that mercy gets you killed and fear keeps you alive." The crowd was silent. "For 20 years I've ruled Ravenspire through that fear. Through discipline that looked like cruelty, through violence that prevented greater violence. And it worked. This fortress has been secure. Our territories have been protected. Our people have survived when neighboring houses collapsed into chaos." He paused, letting the words settle. "But today I discovered that my most trusted commander spent those same 20 years planning my assassination, planning to seize power by framing me for murder and coordinating with enemies who want to see Ravenspire destroyed. Lord Thaddeus Crane, who fought beside my father, who I considered family, betrayed everything we built together. Thaddeus was dragged forward by guards, his hands bound, his face beaten and swollen. Cassian descended the steps until he stood directly in front of the man who'd spent 2 decades wearing loyalty like camouflage. "You wanted to prove I was a monster," Cassian said quietly, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You wanted to show the kingdom that the Duke of Ravenspire was too dangerous to be allowed power. So let me prove you right." He turned to address the assembled crowd. "Thaddeus Crane will not be executed. He will live, but he will live as warning and example." He gestured, and guards brought forward a brazier glowing with heated metal. "He will be branded with the mark of traitor. He will be stripped of title, lands, and name. He will serve Ravenspire for the rest of his life as property instead of person. And every day, he will remember that betraying this house doesn't earn you martyrdom. It earns you survival as something less than human." The crowd murmured. Some looked horrified. Some looked satisfied. All looked terrified. This is what happens when you mistake my restraint for weakness, Cassian continued. This is what happens when you betray the protection you were offered. I don't forgive betrayal. I don't forget it. I transform it into a lesson that everyone else learns without having to make the same mistake. He nodded to the guards. They branded Thaddeus while he screamed. When it was finished, Cassian looked at his household, at all these people who served him out of fear or necessity or genuine loyalty that was impossible to distinguish from survival instinct. I am the monster you fear, he said. I have always been that monster. The only difference is that now you understand exactly what that means. Serve faithfully, and you will be protected with the same brutality I used to destroy enemies. Betray me, and you will learn that death is mercy I no longer offer freely. He turned and walked back into the great hall with Seraphine beside him. Behind them, the crowd dispersed in silence, broken only by Thaddeus's sobbing. Mam Batim. That night, Seraphine found Cassian in his study staring at the fire like it held answers to questions he couldn't articulate. She didn't say anything, just sat beside him and waited. Eventually, he spoke. I branded a man I considered family. Yes, I turned him into property to prove a point about loyalty. Yes, that makes me exactly what everyone says I am. Yes. She reached over and took his hand. But it also keeps us alive, keeps Ravenspire secure, keeps everyone under your protection from being targeted by the next ambitious commander who thinks mercy is weakness to exploit. That doesn't make it right. Right and wrong are luxuries for people who don't have to survive kingdoms built on violence. She squeezed his hand. You did what was necessary, just like you've always done. Cassian was silent for a long moment. Then, I'm not redeemable. I know. And you're staying anyway. I'm staying because redemption is overrated and survival is everything. She looked at him directly, this man who'd protected her from shadows before she knew his name, who'd transformed into something terrifying to keep them both alive. I don't need you to be good, Cassian. I need you to be effective. There's a difference. You're becoming what I am. No, I'm becoming what I need to be to stand beside what you are. Also a difference. He pulled her closer, not gently, but not cruel either. Just desperate in the way people get when they realize they're more alone than they thought. You should have run when you had the chance, probably. But I'm a terrible decision maker. She kissed him, fierce and complicated. Besides, I like building fortresses more than I like escaping them. Even when the fortress is made of brutality and fear? Especially then. Those are the only fortresses that survive. They sat in the firelight while Ravenspire settled into new order built on fresh brutality, and outside the walls, Duke Armand prepared for retaliation he couldn't anticipate. Because the Duke of Ravenspire wasn't pretending to be civilized anymore, and the Duchess standing beside him had learned that survival required becoming the thing everyone feared. Together, they were about to teach the kingdom exactly what happened when monsters stopped apologizing for teeth. Duke Armand's response arrived 3 days after Thaddeus's public branding, delivered by messenger who looked like he'd rather be literally anywhere else on Earth. The letter was brief, brutal, exactly what Cassian expected from a man who'd just lost his inside advantage and was scrambling to maintain control of a situation spiraling toward total war. It demanded Cassian's immediate surrender and appearance before the king to answer murder charges. It promised clemency for Ravenspire's household if the Duke submitted peacefully. It threatened complete annihilation if he refused. Cassian read it once, set it on fire, watched it burn to ash. Then he summoned his war council. What remained of his war council, anyway? Thaddeus's betrayal had carved through the command structure like a blade through silk. Half the senior officers were dead or imprisoned. The other half were under suspicion until proven otherwise. Trust had become a luxury Ravenspire couldn't afford. Seraphine sat at Cassian's right hand where Thaddeus used to sit. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The Duchess had transformed from decorative wife into operational commander in less than 3 months. Some of the remaining officers looked uncomfortable with this development. Most looked terrified to object. Terror was appropriate. Duke Armand is mobilizing everything he has, Helena Voss reported. She was master of intelligence, a woman whose face looked carved from suspicion and whose loyalty was proven through decades of service that predated Cassian's birth. 3,000 soldiers, artillery, siege equipment. He's not planning skirmishes. He's planning to erase Ravenspire from the map. Let him come, Cassian said. His voice carried the kind of calm that preceded hurricanes. How long until his forces reach our borders? 4 days. Maybe 5, if the weather worsens. And our strength? 1,500 soldiers. Another 300 militia if we conscript from the villages. We're outnumbered 2 to 1, and that's before accounting for his superior artillery. Helena didn't soften the assessment. If we fight this as conventional siege warfare, we lose. Ravenspire falls. Everyone inside dies. The room was silent except for wind battering the windows and fire crackling in the hearth. Then we don't fight it as conventional siege warfare, Seraphine said. All eyes turned to her. She stood up and moved to the map table where territories were marked in colors that represented power and threat in equal measure. Armand expects us to defend the fortress. He expects us to entrench behind these walls and force him to break through fortifications that have stood for 3 centuries. She traced a route along the map. What he doesn't expect is for us to abandon defensive positions entirely and strike his supply lines before his army even reaches Ravenspire. That's suicide, one of the officers said. His name was Marcus Verne, a career soldier who'd survived 4 different military campaigns through a combination of skill and paranoia. We don't have the numbers for offensive operations. We don't need numbers. Seraphine looked at Cassian. We need precision, speed, and willingness to do things Armand thinks are beneath the Duke of Ravenspire's dignity. Cassian studied the map, his mind already calculating angles of attack that existed outside conventional military doctrine. You want to fight like guerrillas instead of an army. I want to fight like people who have nothing left to lose, she corrected. Armand's supply chain is stretched across 100 miles of territory. Food, ammunition, medical supplies. Everything his army needs to sustain a siege. If we destroy those supplies before he reaches us, his army starves. Soldiers don't fight well when they're starving. They also don't fight well when they're being hunted, Cassian added, his voice taking on an edge that made several officers shift uncomfortably. We don't need to defeat 3,000 soldiers in open battle. We just need to make sure they never reach Ravenspire combat ready. Helena leaned forward, interest replacing skepticism. You're proposing asymmetric warfare, hit and run, sabotage. Psychological terror. I'm proposing we become the nightmare they tell stories about, Cassian said. Armand wants to prove I'm a monster? Fine. I'll be the kind of monster that makes soldiers desert rather than face what's waiting in the dark. The officers looked at each other. This wasn't how dukes fought wars. This wasn't honorable. This wasn't civilized. This was survival stripped down to teeth and claws. How do we deploy? Marcus Verne asked. He'd made his choice. Survival over honor. Smart man. 3 strike teams, Seraphine said, her finger tracing routes on the map. 50 soldiers each. Mobile. Self-sufficient. Operating independently to maximize chaos. Team 1 targets supply convoys. Team 2 destroys ammunition depots. Team 3 focuses on psychological warfare, leaving evidence that makes Armand's soldiers think twice about continuing this campaign. What kind of evidence? Someone asked. The kind that makes men realize dying for Duke Armand's ambition isn't worth the gold he's paying them. Cassian's smile could have cut through armor. We make this personal. We make it terrifying. We make every soldier in that army understand that they're not fighting for territory or glory. They're fighting a predator that doesn't take prisoners and doesn't show mercy. That's a war crime, one officer said quietly. No, Cassian replied. That's Tuesday. War crimes require someone surviving to report them. I don't plan on leaving witnesses. The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. This was the Duke of Ravenspire without pretense, without the careful control he'd maintained for 20 years. This was what happened when betrayal stripped away the last pieces of humanity he'd been protecting. He'd become exactly what everyone feared, and Seraphine Vale stood beside him planning atrocities like she'd been trained for exactly this scenario. We deploy at midnight, Cassian said. I'll lead Team 3 personally. Seraphine coordinates from Ravenspire with Helena providing intelligence support. Questions? I'll go with you, Seraphine said. No, that wasn't a request. And this isn't a debate. Cassian looked at her directly. You're the only person I trust to hold the fortress if something happens to me. If we both die in the field, Ravenspire falls regardless of how well the strike teams perform. Seraphine's jaw tightened. You're not expendable. Everyone's expendable. He moved around the table until they were close enough to share air, but you're right that I'm harder to replace, which is why I'm taking minimal risks and maximum soldiers. You want partnership? Here's partnership. I trust you to defend what I've built. Trust me to destroy what threatens it. The room held its collective breath. Finally, Seraphine nodded. 48 hours. If you're not back in 48 hours, I'm coming after you. If I'm not back in 48 hours, I'm probably dead. But I appreciate the sentiment. Not sentiment, strategy. You're more useful alive than martyred. Cassian almost smiled. That's the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me. Then, you've been spending time with the wrong people. Probably. The moment stretched between them, heavy with things neither would say in front of an audience. Then Cassian turned back to his officers. Dismissed. Assemble your teams and prepare for midnight deployment. Anyone who questions orders or shows hesitation gets left behind. We're past the point where loyalty can be assumed. The officers filed out. When they were alone, Seraphine moved to where Cassian stood staring at maps that showed territory and threats in equal measure. You're going to do something reckless. Reckless implies lack of calculation. Everything I do is calculated. You're going to do something dangerous that you've calculated has acceptable odds of getting you killed. Semantics. Cassian. He finally looked at her. What do you want me to say? That I'm terrified? That I've never fought a war where I couldn't trust my own command structure? That Thaddeus's betrayal broke something inside me that I don't know how to repair? Yes. All of that. Then yes. All of that. He reached out and pulled her closer, not gently but not cruel either. Just desperate in the way people get when they're staring at odds that don't favor survival. But none of it changes what needs to happen. Armand is coming. If I don't break his army before it reaches these walls, everyone inside Ravenspire dies. You, me, every servant and soldier who chose to stand with us instead of fleeing. That's unacceptable. So you're going to break his army or die trying. That's generally how warfare works, yes. Seraphine was quiet for 3 long seconds. Then, come back alive. That's an order from your Duchess. I'll do my best. Your best better be exceptional. It usually is. She kissed him then, fierce and complicated and desperate in ways neither could articulate. When she pulled back, her eyes were burning with something that looked dangerously close to fear wearing determination's costume. Don't make me rule this fortress alone, she said quietly. I'm not ready. You're more ready than you think. That's not comforting. It's not meant to be. He released her and stepped back, creating distance that felt like tearing something apart. 48 hours. Hold Ravenspire. Trust no one completely. And if I don't come back, burn the journal I kept about you. No one else needs to know how long I was obsessed before I was honest about it. I'm not burning it. Seraphine. It's evidence that monsters can love even if they're terrible at it. That matters. To who? To me. Then Cassian Blackthorne did something he'd spent 32 years avoiding. He told the truth about what he felt instead of what he calculated was strategically useful. I love you, he said. Not the way poets describe it. Not the way civilized people express it. I love you the way predators love territory. Possessive. Absolute. Willing to destroy anything that threatens it. That's not romantic. That's barely human. But it's honest. Seraphine felt something crack in her chest. I know. And you're staying anyway. I'm staying because predatory love is the only kind that survives kingdoms built on violence. She moved to the door, then stopped. 48 hours, Cassian. Don't make me come hunting for your corpse. If it comes to that, please do. I'd hate to be eaten by wolves when I could be properly buried. Not funny. Little bit funny. She left before he could see her cry. Behind her, the Duke of Ravenspire stood alone in firelight and prepared to become something even worse than the monster everyone feared. Whoops. Midnight came cold and sharp as execution. The strike teams assembled in Ravenspire's courtyard wearing black that disappeared into darkness and carrying weapons designed for close-quarters brutality. No banners, no ceremony, no speeches about honor or glory. Just 50 soldiers who'd chosen survival over civilization, preparing to commit atrocities in service of protecting the only home they'd ever known. Cassian addressed them briefly. Duke Armand is bringing 3,000 soldiers to destroy Ravenspire. We can't fight them as an army, so we're going to fight them as Nightmare. You'll target supply convoys, ammunition depots, officer quarters, medical stations. Anything that makes his soldiers realize continuing this campaign means dying badly in the dark while their commanders sleep safely behind fortifications. He paused. This isn't warfare. This is terror. If any of you have moral objections to becoming the villain in Duke Armand's army stories, leave now. I won't judge you. No one moved. Good. Because anyone who hesitates gets their entire team killed. These aren't honorable enemies. These are soldiers being paid to murder everyone you've ever protected. Show them exactly what happens when predators get cornered with nothing left to lose. The teams deployed in silence. Cassian led Team 3 personally, 50 soldiers who'd proven themselves capable of violence that made other violent men uncomfortable. They moved through snow-covered terrain like smoke, covering ground with efficiency that came from training and desperation in equal measure. Their first target was a supply convoy 15 miles from Ravenspire's borders. 12 wagons loaded with grain, ammunition, medical supplies. 30 guards. All of them confident they were too far from enemy territory to worry about ambush. They were wrong. Cassian's team hit them an hour before dawn when visibility was worst and exhaustion was highest. Arrows from the darkness. Blades in the confusion. Soldiers dying before they understood they were under attack. The guards who survived the initial assault tried to organize defensive positions, tried to protect the supplies they'd been hired to transport, tried to prove they were professional soldiers instead of scared men facing something that hunted humans the way wolves hunted deer. They failed. The entire engagement lasted 8 minutes. When it ended, 30 guards were dead, 12 supply wagons were burning, and Cassian's team melted back into darkness, carrying additional weapons and leaving behind evidence specifically designed to create terror. They carved the Blackthorn crest into bodies, left messages that promised worse for anyone who continued marching toward Ravenspire, took one survivor and sent him running back toward Duke Armand's main force with instructions to tell everyone exactly what he'd seen. Mercy wasn't the goal. Information warfare was the goal. Make every soldier in Armand's army understand that dying for their duke's ambition meant dying badly in ways that would haunt their families for generations. Over the next 40 hours, Cassian's team hit 7 more targets. An ammunition depot guarded by 50 soldiers, destroyed. An officer encampment where senior commanders planned siege strategy, burned while they slept. A medical station treating wounded from earlier skirmishes, obliterated. Every attack was surgical. Every attack left evidence. Every attack sent survivors running back to tell stories that made continuation look less like military campaign and more like suicide pact. By the 36th hour, Duke Armand's army had lost a third of its supplies and a quarter of its morale. Soldiers were deserting. Officers were arguing. And Duke Armand himself was discovering that overwhelming numbers didn't matter when your enemy refused to fight by rules that made overwhelming numbers relevant. But Armand wasn't stupid. He'd built a coalition through manipulation and calculation. He understood that conventional warfare favored defenders, and he knew that Duke Cassian Blackthorn was somewhere in the field conducting guerrilla operations instead of defending his fortress, which meant Ravenspire was vulnerable. The attack on Ravenspire came at dawn on the second day, not from Duke Armand's main force, which was still 70 miles away dealing with shattered supply lines and deserting soldiers. From a secondary force he'd kept hidden specifically for this scenario. 500 soldiers. Professional killers hired from mercenary companies that didn't care about moral complications. Led by a commander named Victor Strand, who'd built a reputation for taking fortresses that shouldn't fall through combinations of brutality and tactical brilliance. They hit Ravenspire's southern wall with siege equipment that appeared seemingly from nowhere. Ladders, battering rams, artillery that turned sections of 300-year-old fortifications into rubble and corpse paste. Seraphine was in the war room when the first explosion shook the fortress hard enough to crack stone. She didn't panic. Panic was for people who hadn't spent 3 months learning that survival required ice-cold calculation under pressure that would break most humans into screaming animals. "Report," she commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos of advisors shouting over each other. Helena Voss appeared, her face grim. 500 soldiers attacking the southern wall. Professional mercenaries. They've already breached the outer defenses. If we don't reinforce immediately, they'll be inside the fortress within an hour. Where's our strength? 800 soldiers still in the fortress. The rest deployed with the Duke's strike teams. We have numbers advantage, but these are veterans fighting against a mix of regulars and militia. Then we make the veterans fight on our terms instead of theirs. Seraphine moved to the map table where Ravenspire's defenses were marked in detail, Cassian had spent decades refining. Fall back to the second wall, abandon the outer courtyard entirely, let them think they're winning while we funnel them into kill zones. That's sacrificing defensive positions, one advisor objected. That's sacrificing positions we can't hold to create positions we can destroy them from, Seraphine corrected. She looked at Helena. How long until the Duke returns? Unknown. He's 40 miles into enemy territory and operating under communication blackout. Even if we could reach him, he couldn't return in time, so we hold without him. Against 500 professional soldiers led by Victor Strand, Helena's expression suggested this was a death sentence, not a strategy. My lady, perhaps we should consider evacuation. And go where? Seraphine interrupted. Every house in the kingdom wants us dead or controlled. There's no evacuation. There's only defense or annihilation. She looked around the war room at advisors who'd spent decades following orders from men and suddenly found themselves following orders from a woman who'd been Duchess for less than a season. I understand you're terrified. I'm terrified. But terror doesn't change what needs to happen. We hold this fortress until the Duke returns, or we die proving that Ravenspire doesn't fall while Blackthorns still breathe. The room was silent for 3 seconds. Then Helena Voss smiled, sharp and deadly. Orders, Duchess, Buck. The defense of Ravenspire became the kind of battle that military historians would study for generations, assuming anyone survived to write the history. Seraphine fought like someone who'd learned that survival required becoming the thing everyone feared. She coordinated defensive positions from the battlements where arrows fell like rain and soldiers died screaming. She personally led a counterattack when mercenaries breached the second wall, her blade opening throats and her voice cutting through chaos like command incarnate. She was terrifying. She was also 21 years old and fighting veterans who'd killed more people than she'd met in her entire life. The mercenaries pushed deeper into Ravenspire's defenses with precision that came from hundreds of successful sieges. They knew how to break fortifications, knew how to exploit weaknesses, knew how to turn defensive positions into death traps for defenders who couldn't retreat without abandoning their entire strategy. By midday, the fortress was burning in 3 separate locations. By afternoon, they'd lost the second wall entirely. By sunset, Seraphine stood in this great hall with 200 soldiers against 500 mercenaries who'd just broken through the final defensive position. This was it, the last stand. The place where either Ravenspire held or everyone inside died, proving that even monsters could be killed if you brought sufficient violence. Victor Strand walked into the great hall like he owned it. He was tall, scarred, and carried violence the way other men carried titles. His armor was stained with blood that hadn't finished drying. His sword dripped red onto marble floors that had witnessed 3 centuries of House Blackthorn history. Duchess Seraphine, he said pleasantly, I'm impressed. Genuinely impressed. You've held this fortress far longer than expected, but the outcome was never in question. Surrender now, and I promise your soldiers will be treated fairly. Resist further, and I'll personally ensure every person in Ravenspire suffers before they die. Seraphine stood at the top of the hall's stairs with soldiers flanking her, all of them wounded, all of them exhausted, all of them watching their Duchess decide whether they lived or died. She thought about Cassian, 40 miles away, fighting his own war. She thought about the journal documenting 4 years of protection from shadows. She thought about partnership that looked like possession and obsession that wore love's costume. She thought about surviving. Then she made a choice that would either save them or ensure they died together. Victor Strand, she said, her voice carrying across the hall. You're right. The outcome was never in question. You just misunderstood which outcome was inevitable. She raised her hand. Explosives detonated throughout the Great Hall in positions she'd spent the past 6 hours having soldiers secretly install. The floor beneath the mercenaries erupted. Walls collapsed. Sections of ceiling came down like judgment. Strand's 500 professional soldiers found themselves in a fortress that had become tomb, and the Duchess of Ravenspire stood above the carnage, smiling like someone who'd learned that survival required sacrifice that made civilized people vomit. You wanted Ravenspire? She shouted over the screams. Welcome! Hope you enjoy dying inside it. The battle became slaughter. Mercenaries trapped in collapsing architecture. Soldiers crushed beneath stone they'd thought was stable. Victor Strand himself impaled by falling debris while screaming orders no one could follow. When the smoke cleared, maybe 50 mercenaries still lived. They surrendered immediately. Seraphine accepted their surrender with the efficiency of someone who'd learned brutality from the Duke of Ravenspire himself. Then she had them executed anyway because mercy created complications, and she was past the point where complications were survivable. By full dark, the Great Hall looked like battlefield painted in stone and blood, and Seraphine Vale stood in the center of devastation she'd personally orchestrated, covered in gore that wasn't hers, wondering if the woman who'd arrived at Ravenspire 6 months ago would even recognize what she'd become. Ding. Cassian returned to Ravenspire at midnight to find his fortress half destroyed and his wife standing in ruins that looked like something from apocalyptic nightmares. He dismounted and walked through the shattered southern gate where bodies were still being cleared and fires were still burning in buildings that would need complete reconstruction. Helena Voss met him in the courtyard. "Your Grace, welcome back. Report, 500 mercenaries attacked while you were in the field. The Duchess held them, barely. We lost 300 soldiers, another 100 wounded. The Great Hall is structurally compromised. The southern wall needs complete rebuilding, but Ravenspire stands." "Where is she?" "In your study. She hasn't moved since the battle ended. I'm not sure she's sleeping. I'm not sure she's even blinking." Cassian felt ice settle in his chest. "Casualties among the attackers?" "Complete. She took no prisoners initially, then executed the ones who surrendered after. Her exact words were that mercy creates complications we can't afford." Helena paused. "She's become what you are, Your Grace, and I don't think she knows how to be anything else anymore." Cassian walked through his destroyed fortress toward the study where 4 months ago he'd confessed 4 years of obsession and watched his carefully built world crack apart. He found Seraphine exactly where Helena said she'd be, sitting in front of cold fireplace staring at nothing with eyes that had seen too much too fast. She didn't look up when he entered. "You're alive," she said quietly. "So are you. 500 soldiers attacked Ravenspire today. I killed them. Most of them. The ones I didn't kill directly, I killed through strategy that involved collapsing the Great Hall on their heads while they thought they'd won. I heard. I executed the survivors. All of them. Even the ones who begged. Even the ones who were barely old enough to hold swords. I know. I've become a monster." "Yes." Cassian knelt in front of her, forcing her to look at him instead of the wall. "You did what was necessary. You held Ravenspire against impossible odds using tactics that I would have used in your position. That's not monstrous. That's survival. It feels monstrous. That's because you're still human enough to care. The real monsters don't feel anything when they do terrible things. You feel everything. You just do them anyway because the alternative is worse." He took her hands, noting the blood still caked under her fingernails. "That makes you dangerous, but it doesn't make you lost." "How do you know?" "Because I've been where you are, standing in aftermath and wondering if the person you were still exists anywhere inside the person you've become." He pulled her closer. "And I can tell you from decades of experience that the answer is complicated. Parts of who you were die. They have to. Survival requires sacrificing pieces of yourself that civilized existence demands you keep. But the core remains if you protect it carefully enough." "What core?" "The part that knows why you're doing terrible things. The part that remembers you're protecting something instead of just destroying for destruction's sake." She looked at him finally, really looked at him, and Cassian saw exhaustion and trauma and determination in equal measure. "You held Ravenspire. You saved everyone inside these walls. That matters more than the methods you used to accomplish it." "Does it?" "Yes. Even if the methods include becoming exactly what everyone fears, especially then." He stood up, pulling her with him. Fear is just another form of respect when it's earned through competence instead of random cruelty. You've earned it, Seraphine. Now you just have to decide if you can live with what that means. She was silent for a long moment. Then, Duke Armand's main force. Where are they? 70 miles away and fracturing. His supply lines are shattered. His soldiers are deserting. His officers are arguing about whether continuing the campaign is suicide. He's lost. He just doesn't know it yet. Cassian moved to the window where dawn was starting to break over a fortress that had survived another siege through combinations of brutality and desperate strategy. But he'll know it tomorrow when I ride to his camp and offer him one chance to surrender before I finish what he started. You're going to face him directly. I'm going to end this permanently. No more coalition, no more threats. No more wondering when the next assassination attempt will come. He looked at her directly. I'm going to kill Duke Armand in front of his entire army and make sure every house in the kingdom understands that challenging Ravenspire means extinction. That's a declaration of total war. No. That's a declaration that the war is over and we won. There's a difference. Seraphine walked to stand beside him at the window. Take me with you. Cassian turned to look at her. This woman who'd arrived at Ravenspire as payment for debts and transformed into something that matched him in brutality. You just survived a siege that should have killed you. You need rest. I need to see this finished. She met his eyes without flinching. We started this together. We end it together. Partnership, remember? Partnership implies equality. Then consider this equal. You destroy Armand. I witness it. Together we prove to the kingdom that House Blackthorn doesn't just survive threats. It eliminates them so thoroughly that no one ever makes the mistake of becoming a threat again. Cassian studied her for 3 long seconds. Then, dawn. We ride at dawn. Full military escort, armor, weapons. Everything designed to make Duke Armand understand he's not negotiating surrender. He's receiving execution date. And if he refuses, then his army watches him die screaming, and we take everyone who still wants to fight and introduce them to what happens when monsters stop pretending to be civilized. Seraphine felt something settle in her chest. Not peace, just acceptance that survival required becoming the thing everyone feared and making sure the fear was justified. Together, the Duke and Duchess of Ravenspire stood in firelight and prepared for the final confrontation that would either cement their power permanently or destroy them both in front of an audience of thousands. Outside, dawn broke over a kingdom that didn't know it yet, but the balance of power was about to shift so dramatically that the entire aristocracy would spend decades trying to understand what happened the day 2 predators decided mercy was overrated and survival was everything. Dawn broke over Duke Armand's encampment like judgment delivered in shades of gray and gold. Cassian and Seraphine rode through snow-covered terrain with 200 soldiers flanking them in formation designed less for protection and more for spectacle. This wasn't a military maneuver. This was theater. The kind where the audience watches something they'll remember for the rest of their lives and tells their grandchildren about in whispers that carry equal parts awe and terror. They wore full armor that caught the morning light and transformed them into something that belonged in paintings people stared at, trying to understand how humans could look that dangerous. Cassian's black plate was etched with the blackthorn crest in silver that seemed to bleed light. Seraphine wore armor custom forged for a woman who'd become weapon instead of ornament, dark steel with threading that made her look like winter personified. Together they looked like the end of something, which was exactly the point. Duke Armand's camp sprawled across a valley that should have been beautiful if it weren't filled with 3,000 soldiers, who'd spent the past week watching their campaign collapse through combinations of guerrilla warfare and systematic terror. Tents stretched for miles. Cookfires sent smoke into air that smelled like desperation and poor decisions. Soldiers stood at their posts with expressions that suggested they'd rather be literally anywhere else. Morale was a corpse that hadn't finished rotting. Cassian could smell it from half a mile away. The sentries who spotted them approaching didn't sound alarms. They just watched with faces that had seen too much violence in too short a time frame to generate appropriate fear responses. One of them, a boy who couldn't have been older than 19, stared at the Duke and Duchess of Ravenspire like he was watching his own execution approach in slow motion. Smart kid. Cassian and Seraphine rode through the camp without being challenged. Soldiers stepped aside. Officers watched from distances they thought were safe. No one drew weapons. No one issued commands to halt or identify themselves, because everyone knew exactly who they were, and everyone understood what their presence meant. Duke Armand's command tent sat at the camp's center, a structure large enough to house tactical planning and military strategy, and the kind of desperation that came from watching a perfect plan disintegrate in real time. Guards stood outside with hands on sword hilts and expressions that suggested they knew those swords wouldn't make a difference. Cassian dismounted. Seraphine followed. They walked to the tent entrance side by side. "Tell Duke Armand that Duke Cassian Blackthorn requests his presence," Cassian said to the nearest guard. His voice carried the kind of calm that preceded executions. "And tell him if he doesn't emerge in the next 60 seconds, I'm coming inside. And if I come inside, significantly more people die than necessary." The guard disappeared into the tent. 53 seconds later, Duke Armand emerged. He looked like a man who'd spent a week discovering that ambition had costs he hadn't calculated accurately. His face was drawn, his eyes were bloodshot, his uniform, which should have been pristine for a duke of his station, carried stains that suggested he'd been too busy managing catastrophe to maintain appearances. "Cassian," he said. The informality was deliberate, an attempt to establish familiarity that might create negotiating space. "I wasn't expecting you to visit personally. You should have been." Cassian's expression was carved from ice and old violence. "You declared war on Ravenspire. You coordinated assassination attempts. You murdered civilians to provoke response. Did you think I'd send a messenger to discuss terms? I think we're both reasonable men who can find diplomatic solution to territorial disagreement. There is no territorial disagreement. There's you making catastrophic mistake, and me deciding how many of your soldiers die before you understand the mistake was fatal." Armand's jaw tightened. "My army still outnumbers yours 3-1. Your army has lost a third of its supplies, a quarter of its officers, and most of its will to continue fighting for a duke who coordinated with traitors to murder his political opponents." Cassian moved closer, his voice dropping into something colder. "I know about Thaddeus Crane. I know about Lenora Whitfeld. I know about every meeting, every letter, every promise you made to people stupid enough to think betraying me was survivable. Your coalition is finished. Your campaign is over. The only question left is whether you die quickly or slowly." The camp around them had gone silent. Thousands of soldiers watching their duke face the man who'd spent a week transforming military campaign into nightmare. "You're threatening to execute me in front of my own army," Armand said carefully. "I'm not threatening anything." Cassian smiled, brief and devastating. "I'm explaining what happens next, so you have time to prepare yourself mentally. Because I'm civilized that way." Seraphine moved to stand beside Cassian, her presence adding weight to threat that was already suffocating. "You coordinated an attack on Ravenspire while the Duke was in the field. 500 mercenaries. Professional killers hired specifically to murder everyone inside the fortress, while my husband was conducting operations against your supply lines." She tilted her head slightly, studying Armand like he was a problem that required solving. "Did you genuinely believe that would work? Or were you just hoping we'd both die and you could claim the territory without facing consequences?" "I was hoping to remove a threat to regional stability," Armand replied. His voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. "Duke Cassian has ruled through fear and brutality for 20 years. Someone needed to establish that such governance isn't acceptable in civilized society, and you decided that someone was you. Someone had to have courage." "Courage." Cassian's voice could have cut through armor. "You call coordination with traitors courage. You call assassination of political opponents courage. You call attacking a fortress defended primarily by civilians courage. That's interesting vocabulary. What would you call it? Cowardice wearing strategy's costume." He was close enough now that Armand could see his own reflection in Cassian's eyes. Real courage is facing threats directly. Real courage is accepting that power requires visible accountability. You hid behind proxies and plotted in shadows and convinced yourself that made you smart instead of contemptible. "So you're going to kill me for being contemptible?" "No, I'm going to kill you for being a threat. The contemptible part just makes it more satisfying." Cassian drew his sword in a movement too fast to track. The blade caught sunlight and transformed it into something that looked like liquid silver. Armand stepped back, his hand going to his own weapon. "You can't execute me without trial. The king will have you hanged for murder. The king will thank me for removing a problem he was too diplomatic to handle himself." Cassian advanced slowly, giving Armand space to draw his sword if he had the courage to die fighting. "And if he doesn't, I'll simply add him to the list of obstacles that need removing. Because I'm done pretending that civilization matters more than survival. You taught me that when you burned villages and murdered children to prove a point about my character. I was proving you're a monster, and I'm about to prove that monsters are what keep the kingdom functional. Draw your weapon, Armand. At least die with the dignity you've been pretending to have." Armand drew his sword with hands that couldn't stop shaking. He was a competent fighter. He'd trained with military instructors. He'd survived court politics that killed most players before they reached his age. None of it mattered. Cassian Blackthorne had been killing people since he was 13 years old and had spent 20 years refining violence into something that looked like art if you tilted your head and ignored the corpses. The fight lasted maybe 20 seconds. Armand managed 2 strikes that Cassian deflected without apparent effort. He attempted a third that left him exposed for less than a second. A second was all Cassian needed. His blade opened Armand's throat in a strike so precise it looked choreographed. Blood sprayed across snow in patterns that would have fascinated painters, if painters had been present to see it. Armand dropped his sword and clutched at his throat, like he could hold his life inside through sheer willpower. He couldn't. He collapsed in the snow while 3,000 soldiers watched their duke bleed out in front of the man they'd been ordered to destroy. Cassian cleaned his blade on Armand's uniform with movements that suggested this was Tuesday, rather than execution that would reshape regional power dynamics for decades. Then he looked at the assembled army. Duke Armand is dead. His campaign against Ravenspire is finished. Any soldier who wishes to continue fighting can step forward now, and I'll give you the same opportunity I gave your duke. Anyone who'd rather go home to their families can leave. I won't stop you. I won't pursue you. I'll simply remember that when given the choice between dying for a dead man's ambition and surviving to see next spring, you chose survival. No one moved. The silence stretched long enough that Seraphine wondered if this was the moment where everything collapsed into violence that would kill them both regardless of how well they'd planned. Then one soldier, a veteran who looked like he'd survived too many campaigns already, dropped his weapon in the snow and walked away. Another followed, then 10, then 100. Within 5 minutes, Duke Armand's entire army was dispersing like smoke and wind. Officers tried to maintain order, tried to establish command structure, tried to convince soldiers that retreat without authorization was desertion worthy of execution. No one cared. They'd watched their duke die in 20 seconds against an opponent who'd barely moved. They'd spent a week being hunted through darkness by strike teams that killed without mercy or hesitation. They'd signed up for military campaign with reasonable odds, not suicide mission designed by commanders who'd underestimated exactly how dangerous the Duke of Ravenspire could be when survival was the only law that mattered. Cassian watched the army dissolve with expression that revealed nothing. When the last soldier had disappeared beyond the camp's perimeter, he turned to Seraphine. "That's how you end wars," he said quietly. "Not through negotiation or diplomacy or carefully worded treaties. You identify the threat. You eliminate the threat. You make sure everyone watching understands that becoming a threat means extinction. Is that what you learned from your father? No. My father believed in mercy and justice and governance through principles that got him murdered by relatives who saw those principles as weakness to exploit." He paused, looking at the body cooling in the snow. "I learned this from watching him die and deciding I'd rather be the monster who survives than the saint who gets carved apart by people who mistake compassion for opportunity." Seraphine was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Do you regret becoming the monster?" Cassian considered the question with the same intensity he applied to everything requiring honest assessment, every day. But regret doesn't change the fact that it works. Monsters survive. Saints get canonized after they're dead. I prefer survival. Even if survival requires killing people in front of audiences designed to create terror, especially then. He looked at her directly. "You asked me once why I showed you the northern villages. Why I wanted you to see both the brutality and the protection. This is why. Because power without purpose is just cruelty, but power with purpose is what keeps people alive when the world tries to kill them. I am brutal. I am terrifying. I will continue being both those things because the alternative is Ravenspire falling and everyone under my protection dying because I chose principles over pragmatism. That's the loneliest philosophy I've ever heard." "Yes, it is." He reached out and touched her face with hands that had just killed a man and would kill again without hesitation if circumstances required. "But it's less lonely now, because you understand it. You've become it. And maybe that makes us both monsters, but at least we're monsters together." Seraphine covered his hand with hers. "We should probably head home. Our fortress is half destroyed and our household is terrified we're both dead." "Probably." They stood in the ruins of Duke Armand's camp while snow fell and covered evidence of execution that would be discussed in royal courts for generations. Eventually, they'd have to face the king. Eventually, they'd have to explain why they'd eliminated a duke without trial. Eventually, the consequences of survival through brutality would require navigation that made battlefield strategy look simple. But not today. Today, they'd won. And winning, for people who'd spent months learning that survival required sacrificing pieces of themselves they'd never recover, felt exactly like standing in snow beside someone who understood why the sacrifice was necessary. The ride back to Ravenspire happened in silence that felt less like exhaustion and more like two predators processing what they'd become. Seraphine watched the landscape pass and tried to remember the woman who'd arrived at this fortress 6 months ago expecting a tyrant. That woman seemed like fiction now, a character in a story about someone naive enough to believe survival could be achieved without becoming something unrecognizable. She'd been wrong about everything. Tyrants were simple. They ruled through fear alone. Cassian ruled through fear combined with protection so comprehensive it looked like love if you didn't examine the foundation too closely. He was more complicated than tyranny, more dangerous than simple cruelty, and she'd fallen in love with exactly that complication. Not despite the brutality, because the brutality served something larger than itself. "You're quiet," Cassian observed. "I'm calculating how many people I've killed in the past week. And? Enough that I've lost count." She looked at him. "Does it get easier?" "No, it gets more familiar. There's a difference. That's not comforting. It's not meant to be." He was quiet for 3 long seconds. "The first person I killed was my uncle. I was 13. He'd participated in my father's murder and thought a child posed no threat. I strangled him with the curtain cord while he slept and then hid the body in a storage closet for 2 days before anyone found it." Seraphine felt her breath catch. "That's horrifying. That's survival." Cassian's voice was flat, empty of emotion that would make the memory bearable. "I had a choice. Except that my father's murderers would control Ravenspire and probably kill me eventually, or become something capable of taking back what belonged to my family. I chose survival. Everything since then has been elaboration on that original choice. Do you regret it? Every single day. But regret doesn't change the fact that it was necessary." He looked at her directly. "You killed 500 soldiers to hold Ravenspire. You executed prisoners who begged for mercy. You collapsed a building on people who were following orders from commanders they trusted. That will haunt you. But it was also necessary, and necessity doesn't care about your conscience. So we just accept that we're monsters and move on? No. We accept that we did monstrous things to protect what matters, and we make sure what matters justifies the cost." He reached over and took her hand. "That's the only way this is survivable long term. You remember why you did it. You remember who you protected. You remember that the alternative was worse. And if the alternative wasn't worse, if we killed people who didn't deserve it, then we live with that. Same way we live with everything else." He squeezed her hand. "Welcome to ruling, Seraphine. It's brutal. It's thankless. And it requires making decisions that civilized people would call crimes. But it's also the only thing standing between everyone under your protection and the kind of chaos that kills thousands instead of hundreds." They rode in silence after that. Two people who'd learned that power came with costs that couldn't be calculated until they were already paid. Ravenspire came into view as sunset turned the sky into something that looked like the world was bleeding. The fortress was scarred, burned, partially collapsed, but still standing, still functional, still the anchor point for territory that had survived another attempt to tear it down. The gates opened without challenge. Guards who'd spent days not knowing if their duke would return alive watched him ride through with expressions that mixed relief with fear, because Cassian Blackthorn had left Ravenspire as a monster constrained by civilization's requirements. He'd returned to something worse, something that had stopped apologizing for teeth. Helena Voss met them in the courtyard. "Your Grace, Duchess, welcome home." She glanced at their armor, noting the bloodstains that hadn't been cleaned. "I assume Duke Armand is no longer a concern." "Duke Armand is no longer anything," Cassian said, dismounting. His army dispersed. His coalition collapsed. Anyone who still wants to challenge Ravenspire can get in line behind everyone else who learned that challenging this fortress means extinction. And the king will summon us within the week to explain why we executed a duke without trial. Cassian handed his reins to a stable hand. "Prepare diplomatic correspondence. I'll need detailed documentation of every crime Armand committed, every piece of evidence linking him to Thaddeus's betrayal, and every testimony from soldiers who participated in his campaign. When we stand before the king, I want overwhelming proof that what we did was justice instead of murder. And if the king disagrees, then we add him to the list of obstacles that need removing." Cassian's voice was flat. "I'm done pretending that civilization matters more than survival. If the king wants to execute me for eliminating a threat to regional stability, he's welcome to try. But he should understand that trying means civil war. Helena looked genuinely concerned. Your Grace, perhaps diplomacy? Diplomacy is what got us into this situation. Diplomacy is why Duke Armand thought he could coordinate assassination attempts without consequence. Diplomacy is weakness wearing negotiations costume. He started walking toward the fortress. From now on, we operate on different principle. You threaten Ravenspire, you die. You betray House Blackthorn, you become example. You mistake my restraint for mercy, you learn the difference permanently. Clear? Crystal, Your Grace. Good. Now get me updated casualty reports, reconstruction timelines, and intelligence on which houses are going to use Armand's death as excuse to create new coalitions. I want to know who my enemies are before they finish deciding to become enemies. Helena bowed and disappeared. Seraphine watched Cassian issue commands with efficiency that came from decades of practice, and wondered if this was what the rest of their lives looked like. Permanent siege mentality. Constant threat assessment. Never quite trusting that survival was anything other than temporary condition between attacks. It was exhausting just thinking about it. But it was also the only life that made sense anymore. That night, alone in chambers that had become refuge instead of prison, Cassian and Seraphine sat in silence that felt less comfortable than it should. They'd survived. They'd won. They'd proven that House Blackthorn couldn't be destroyed by conspiracy or coalition or coordinated military campaign. But victory tasted like ash and blood and decisions that would haunt them for whatever remained of their lives. Eventually, Seraphine spoke. I need to tell you something. Cassian looked up from reports he'd been reviewing. What? When I was defending Ravenspire, when I was making decisions about collapsing the Great Hall and executing prisoners, I wasn't thinking about justice or honor or any of the principles I was raised to believe mattered. She met his eyes. I was thinking about you. About making sure you came home to a fortress that still stood. About proving I could be what you needed instead of what I wanted to be. That's not weakness. It feels like weakness. It feels like I've transformed into someone who measures worth by how well I serve your survival instead of my own integrity. Integrity is luxury for people who don't have to make choices between survival and principles. He set down the reports and moved to sit beside her. You held Ravenspire against impossible odds. You made brutal decisions under pressure that would have broken most commanders. You proved that partnership means standing beside me when the world tries to tear everything down. That's not weakness. That's the only kind of strength that matters in kingdoms built on violence. I killed people to prove I could stand beside you. Yes, and I killed people to prove I could protect you. He took her hand. We're both complicit in brutality that serves something larger than ourselves. That's called ruling. It's called surviving. It's called making sure everyone under our protection doesn't die because we chose to be good instead of effective. Seraphine was quiet for a long moment. Do you think we're redeemable? No. And I stopped caring about redemption around the same time I strangled my uncle with a curtain cord. He squeezed her hand. But I think we're human, flawed, brutal, making decisions that cost us pieces of ourselves we'll never recover, but still fundamentally trying to protect something instead of just destroying for destruction's sake. That has to count for something. Does it? I have to believe it does. Otherwise, I've spent 20 years becoming monster for no purpose. And if there is no purpose, if we're just predators wearing protection's costume, then at least we're honest predators. He pulled her closer. Most rulers pretend they're civilized while committing atrocities in secret. We're brutal in public and protective in private. I prefer our version. That's the strangest moral philosophy I've ever heard. Welcome to House Blackthorn. We specialize in strange moral philosophy and survival through methods that make civilized people uncomfortable. Seraphine almost smiled. I love you. I know. That's not the response you're supposed to give. What response am I supposed to give? You're supposed to say you love me back. Cassian was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, I loved you before I knew your name. I've loved you through 4 years of watching from distance. I've loved you through conspiracy and betrayal and warfare that should have killed us both. Saying I love you feels insufficient to describe what I actually feel. So instead I'll say this. You are the only thing in this world that makes brutality feel purposeful. You are the reason I'm more dangerous now than I was before. And you are the only person I'd burn kingdoms for if circumstances required it. Seraphine felt something crack in her chest. That's the most terrifying declaration of love I've ever heard. Then I said it correctly. She kissed him then, fierce and desperate and complicated in ways neither could articulate. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright with something that might have been tears if tears weren't weakness neither could afford. We should probably address the household, she said. Let them know we survived. Let them know Ravenspire stands. In a moment. He held her closer. Right now, I need to remember what surviving feels like when it's not just strategy and violence. What does it feel like? Like standing in ruins with the only person who understands why the ruins were necessary. They sat in firelight while outside the walls. A kingdom processed the fact that the Duke of Ravenspire had executed a peer without trial and walked away unchallenged. Consequences would come. The king would demand accounting. Other houses would test boundaries to see if Cassian's brutality made him vulnerable or untouchable. But not tonight. Tonight, two predators who'd learned that survival required sacrificing everything except each other sat in ruins they'd defended and tried to remember what it felt like to be human instead of weapons. Bam! 3 weeks later, Cassian and Seraphine stood before the king in the capital's throne room while the entire court watched to see if the infamous Duke of Ravenspire would finally face justice for decades of brutality culminating in unauthorized execution. The king was older than Cassian remembered. 70 years sitting on a throne that required balancing power between houses that constantly threatened to tear the kingdom apart through civil war. He looked tired, but not weak. Never weak. Duke Cassian Blackthorn, the king began, his voice carrying across marble halls that had witnessed 3 centuries of royal judgment. You stand accused of executing Duke Armand Vale without trial, without authorization, and without regard for legal process that governs peer-level disputes. How do you answer these charges? Cassian stood in formal armor that made him look like winter personified. Guilty, Your Majesty, the court murmured. Guilty pleas weren't standard. Most accused nobles spent hours constructing elaborate defenses that blamed everyone except themselves. Cassian didn't believe in elaborate defenses. You admit guilt? The king asked. I admit I executed Duke Armand in front of his own army after he'd spent months coordinating assassination attempts, murdering civilians, and collaborating with traitors inside my household to destabilize regional security. Yes, I'm guilty of killing him. I'm not guilty of wrongdoing. That's not your determination to make. With respect, Your Majesty, it absolutely is my determination to make. Cassian's voice was calm but carried edge that suggested he wasn't interested in pretending submission. I am Duke of Ravenspire. I am responsible for protecting territory and people under my governance. When another duke declares war through assassination and conspiracy, I respond with overwhelming force that ensures the threat is permanently eliminated. That's not crime. That's responsibility. You're arguing that might makes right. I'm arguing that survival requires making decisions that civilized people call crimes, but are actually the only thing preventing greater violence. Cassian pulled documents from inside his coat. These are testimonies from soldiers who participated in Duke Armand's campaign. These are financial records showing his coordination with Lord Thaddeus Crane to assassinate me and seize Ravenspire. These are casualty reports from villages he burned to provoke military response. He set them on the table before the king. You want to execute me for eliminating a threat? Fine, but read those documents first and explain how allowing Duke Armand to continue his campaign would have resulted in less death than what I did. The king gestured. Advisors collected the documents and began reviewing them. The silence stretched for 5 full minutes while the court waited to see if the Duke of Ravenspire had just argued himself into execution or provided justification that might save his life. Finally, the king spoke. These documents support your claims. Duke Armand was conducting systematic campaign to destabilize your territory and eliminate you through methods that violate every standard of peer-level conflict. His voice was carefully neutral. However, execution without trial sets dangerous precedent. If every duke eliminated threats without oversight, we'd have civil war within months. Then establish oversight that works faster than threats can kill people, Cassian replied. Because I won't apologize for responding to assassination attempts with permanent solutions. And I won't pretend that legal process matters more than protecting everyone under my governance from predators who use that legal process as shield while conducting atrocities. You're arguing for vigilante justice. I'm arguing that justice delayed is people dead. There's a difference. The king studied Cassian for a long moment. Then he looked at Seraphine, who'd stood silently beside her husband throughout the entire proceeding. Duchess Seraphine, you defended Ravenspire while your husband was conducting operations against Duke Armand's supply lines. Reports suggest you personally directed combat that resulted in 500 casualties. Do you also claim these actions were necessary? Seraphine met the king's eyes without flinching. Yes, your majesty. Duke Armand hired mercenaries specifically to attack while my husband was in the field. I had two choices: surrender and watch everyone inside Ravenspire be slaughtered, or defend with everything available. I chose defense. I chose survival. And yes, 500 soldiers died because of decisions I made, but everyone under our protection lived. That matters more than whether my methods were civilized. The court murmured again. Duchesses weren't supposed to direct military operations. Duchesses weren't supposed to admit to killing 500 soldiers without expressing remorse or justification that centered on feminine virtues like protection of children. Seraphina Vale didn't care what duchesses were supposed to do. She'd learned that survival required destroying expectations along with enemies. The king was silent for another long moment. Then, Duke Cassian, Duchess Seraphine, this court finds that while your methods were brutal and your disregard for legal process is concerning, the evidence supports that Duke Armand presented existential threat to regional stability. You are not guilty of murder. You are guilty of excessive force in response to legitimate threat. What's the punishment for excessive force? Cassian asked. Continued governance of Ravenspire under increased oversight. You will report significant military operations to this court before executing them. You will coordinate with neighboring houses to establish conflict resolution protocols that don't involve assassination. And you will demonstrate that House Blackthorn can rule through something other than terror. And if we refuse, then I'll have you both executed, and Ravenspire will pass to governance that understands cooperation. The king's voice was steel-wrapped in diplomatic language. You survived today because evidence supports your claims. Don't mistake survival for immunity. The kingdom tolerates your brutality because it's been effective. The moment it becomes liability, you'll discover that monsters can be killed if sufficient force is applied properly. Understood, Your Majesty. Good. Then you're dismissed. And Duke Cassian? Yes? Try to go at least one season without executing anyone. It would be refreshing. I'll do my best, Your Majesty. I'm sure you will. The journey back to Ravenspire happened in spring instead of winter. Snow had melted, roads were passable. The world looked less like execution waiting to happen and more like something that might be beautiful if you didn't think too hard about the violence required to maintain stability. We survived, Seraphine said. Again, Cassian added, Does it always feel like this? Like what? Like we escaped instead of won. Yes. Victory feels different when you understand how close you came to losing everything. He was quiet for a moment. My father used to say that real victory isn't defeating enemies. It's surviving long enough to see consequences of your decisions and adjusting strategy accordingly. Your father was wise. My father was murdered by people who mistook wisdom for weakness. He glanced at her. I've spent 20 years making sure no one makes that mistake about me. Now you're doing the same thing. Is that wrong? No. It's survival. But it's also lonely if you don't have someone who understands why the brutality is necessary. Good thing I married a monster who understands exactly that. Good thing the monster married someone who matches him in brutality. They rode in silence after that, two predators who'd learned that survival required partnership more dangerous than possession. Vamsha. Ravenspire had been rebuilt. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough that it functioned as fortress instead of ruin. The Great Hall stood again, reinforced with steel and stone that would take artillery to breach. The southern wall was higher, thicker, designed by military engineers who understood that the next siege wouldn't allow for the kind of desperate defense Seraphine had coordinated. The household had changed too. Servants who'd fled during the siege had been replaced by people who understood that serving House Blackthorn meant accepting that violence was permanent condition rather than temporary crisis. Soldiers walked patrols with expressions that suggested they'd seen things that transformed them from guards into veterans. And in the center of it all, Duke Cassian Blackthorn and Duchess Seraphine Vale ruled with combination of brutality and protection that made neighboring houses uncertain whether to fear them or ally with them. Most chose both. 6 months after Duke Armand's execution, Seraphine stood on the battlements watching sunset turn the ocean into something that looked like liquid gold. Behind her, Ravenspire hummed with the kind of controlled chaos that came from running territory large enough to matter. Cassian joined her, moving to stand close enough that their shoulders touched. "You look contemplative," he observed. "I'm calculating how many people would have died if we'd chosen differently at any point during the past year." And thousands. Maybe tens of thousands, if Armand's coalition had succeeded and triggered broader civil war. She looked at him. "We're monsters, but we're effective monsters. That's the most efficient moral philosophy I've ever heard. I learned from an expert." She was quiet for a moment. "Do you regret any of it? The manipulation, the violence, the transformation of someone who arrived here expecting captivity into someone who matches you in brutality? Every day. But regret doesn't change the fact that it worked." He took her hand. "You're alive. Ravenspire stands. Everyone under our protection survives in a world designed to kill them. That has to be worth something, even if the cost was becoming unrecognizable, especially then, because recognition requires maintaining identity that was never designed for survival." He pulled her closer. "We're not the people we were. We're not the people we thought we'd become. We're what survival required us to transform into. And maybe that's monstrous, but it's also the only honest way to rule in kingdoms built on violence. That's the loneliest philosophy I've ever heard." "Yes, but less lonely when someone stands beside you understanding exactly why it's necessary." They stood in sunset watching the ocean crash against cliffs that had witnessed 3 centuries of House Blackthorn history. Behind them, a fortress that had survived betrayal and siege and transformation that should have destroyed it. Ahead of them, a future that would require continued brutality and impossible choices and decisions that would cost them pieces of themselves they'd never recover. But they'd survive, because survival was the only law that mattered in worlds where predators ruled and weakness meant extinction. And together, the Duke and Duchess of Ravenspire had learned that the most dangerous predators weren't the ones who hunted alone. They were the ones who'd found partners who matched them in teeth, sepets. Years later, historians would debate whether House Blackthorn represented the best or worst of noble governance, whether their methods were justified by results or condemned by brutality, whether Duke Cassian and Duchess Seraphine were heroes who protected their people through impossible circumstances or villains who used protection as excuse for atrocity. The debates would continue for generations. But in Ravenspire, where winters were brutal and survival required strength that most people couldn't comprehend, the household understood something the historians never would. Monsters weren't born. They were forged in necessity, tempered in violence, and refined through choices that civilized people would call crimes, but were actually the only thing standing between survival and extinction. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very careful, you found another monster who understood exactly why the teeth were necessary. That wasn't romance. That was partnership. And in kingdoms built on violence, partnership was the only thing more powerful than fear. The Duke and Duchess of Ravenspire stood together on battlements watching another storm build on the horizon, and neither flinched when thunder rolled across the water like artillery fire, because they'd survived worse. They'd become worse. And together they'd proven that monsters could love even if they were terrible at it. That had to count for something. Even if the counting required admitting that survival came with costs, no amount of justification could ever fully pay. They were still standing, still fighting, still protecting what mattered through methods that made civilized people uncomfortable. And in the end, that was the only victory that mattered in worlds where weakness meant death and strength meant learning to live with what you'd become in service of keeping others alive. The storm reached the cliffs. Rain began to fall. And the Duke and Duchess of Ravenspire walked back inside their fortress, side by side, ready to face whatever came next. Together. Always together. Because that was the only way survival worked in kingdoms where predators ruled, and partnership was the difference between extinction and legacy.